Chapter 493. The news that the fire demon Grim had successfully reached rank 2 spread like wildfire. After receiving this news, Wizard Senazar went silent. Wizard Forgan's eyes flashed with uncertainty. Wizard Ko, on the other hand, was dumbfounded. He didn't know how to react. Rank 2. That was a rank 2 wizard. In any country, in any wizard force, a rank 2 wizard would be a core existence. Just take the Sarubo family for example. If Grim sincerely agreed to stay in the Salubo family, he would probably become the most powerful person in the Salubo family apart from the grade 3 sorceress Senazar. Even the experienced wizard Forgan didn't have the confidence to suppress him. In the past few years, the Salubo family had relied on the 3 demiplanes they controlled to quickly grow their power. Excluding the 3 new wizards that had appeared in the wizard pagoda of the Flame Monarch, the Salubo family had 7 new wizards. This made Ferdinand's city bustle with noise and excitement once again. However, just when the family was at its peak, Grim had reached rank 2 without their knowledge. This was a huge blow to the core members of the family. However, the one who felt the most was Wizard Ko, who was only rank 1. When he heard about Grim's advancement, he stood rooted to the ground for a long time. He couldn't get rid of this shocking news for a long time. It had been more than 120 years since he became a wizard, and his power of the will was only 14 points. He still needed another 20 to 30 years to reach the threshold of rank 16. If he wanted to reach the limit of 20 points, he would need at least 100 years of hard work. On the other hand, Grim had advanced 50 years later than him. But Wizard Ko felt a surge of anger in his heart. His chest was so irritated that he wanted to open his mouth to let out some air. In order to get the full support of the family, he worked diligently and conscientiously to manage all the properties, manors, shops, and resource points for the family. While others were concentrating on their own laboratories, he was tirelessly arranging the apprentice quotas for the various places. While others were traveling around the world to gain experience, he was carefully distributing the resources of the family. While others were meditating in the middle of the night, he was dealing with the endless problems in the family. It was because of his huge investment that the resources and personnel could flow in a reasonable manner, allowing the Salubo family to develop steadily and healthily. Since he had put in so much effort, he naturally received the full support and guidance of his family. This could be seen from his development process. However, there was always a loss. He had gained the trust and respect of the family through his hard work and loyalty. He never lacked resources, and he would get guidance from high-ranking wizards. However, the overwork had also slowed down his progress. In the past, he did not think he had made any mistake. Many times he would even feel proud of himself for being so smart. But today, after hearing the news of Grim's rank up, Wizard Kogan could no longer hold back the anger in his heart. He calmly returned to his residence and activated his protection spell. Afterward, he screamed and cursed as he smashed everything in his room into smithereens. A look of sympathy emerged on Wizard Forgan's face as he watched Kogan leave in a daze. In the wizard world, there were 2 ways to express one's power. The first way was to show off one's power. This was the most direct way for a wizard to gain resources and respect. The second way was to have power. If one couldn't have absolute power, then they would find a way to have someone who had absolute power. Therefore, with power and resources, one could win over all kinds of talents, and then use the resources in one's hands to gain even more power. Just like rolling a snowball, as long as one could establish a healthy cycle of order, then using this method could also make a sorcerer an influential figure in the sorcerer world. Judging from the current situation, Grim was obviously walking the first path, running madly on the path of power. As a rank 1 wizard, he was able to give up many of the troubles in his territory and give his power to a wandering wizard he met by chance. Then, he had to endure 70 years of boredom and loneliness. This was the real reason why he could rise so quickly. Grim seemed to have forgotten that the wizard world was a world where the strong were the core. The centripetal force of power leaning towards power was far greater than the centripetal force of power leaning towards power. Under normal circumstances, power and resources would naturally be accompanied by great power. On the other hand, it was difficult to achieve. But after sympathizing with Grim, Wizard Forgan began to feel fear for himself. The same thing stood out in him. He was not the only rank 2 wizard in his family. All of them had applied to be stationed in the secondary plane, using the harsh environment of the other world to train themselves. He, on the other hand, was stationed in the resource-rich main plane. Even though he had more power than them, he was clearly lagging behind in terms of absolute power. Maybe he needed to make a decision? Forgan couldn't help but let his imagination run wild. The Flame Monarch. The Wizard's Pagoda was a sea of joy. Under the joint efforts of the Wizard Tower's wizard and the resident wizard, the mysterious master of the Wizard's Pagoda, who had been hiding in the upper levels of the Wizard's Pagoda for many years, had once again appeared in front of the Wizard's Pagoda's apprentices. Even though Lord Grimm still needed to stabilize his mental state and did not appear in the Wizard Hall on the second level, the atmosphere still ignited the emotions of every Wizard's Pagoda's apprentices. The wizard world was a world that pursued the strong. What could be more exciting than following a powerful magus? In the foreseeable future, every wizard and apprentice under the Flame Monarch would be able to obtain 2 or 3 times the resources of the past. This was what they valued the most. Just as the crowd was celebrating, Bliss was summoned by Grimm to the 5th level of the Wizard's Pagoda and disappeared into the teleportation formation. The Tower of Destiny. As the dense white light slowly dissipated, Bliss silently endured the heavy pressure brought about by the change in space. He opened his eyes to size up a strange little life form that had appeared beside the teleportation formation. It was a human girl the size of a palm, with a pair of thin dragonfly-like wings on her back. As she flew in the air, specks of light would fall from her back. Elemental elf? Bliss could not help but lick his lips a few times. Under the shadow of his hood, his green pupils emitted a greedy green light. "Come with me, you big worm." The elemental elf Helen, who was holding a magic wand in her hand, obviously did not like this strange fellow who was hidden in a thick black robe. Hence, her tone was exceptionally sharp. After saying that, Helen flapped her wings and flew away. "Damned fellow, I'll eat you one day." Bliss cursed viciously as he hobbled after the little elf with the foul mouth. 2 wizards, 1 male and 1 female, were already waiting in the stargazing hall at the top level of the Tower of Destiny. The male wizard was a strange humanoid figure formed from flames. Judging from his appearance and figure, as well as the soul ripples radiating from his body, he was Bliss's master, the level 2 fire wizard Grimm. The female sorcerer was tall and graceful. She wore a purple starry robe, and the faint starlight bathed her body, giving her a mysterious and beautiful illusory appearance. She wasn't very old, and her face was gentle and quiet. Her long and narrow almond-shaped eyes paired with her azure-blue pupils gave off a coquettish and mysterious feeling. Bliss was slightly taken aback. In the Flame Monarch's Wizard Pagoda, his master Grimm had just sent him into the teleportation spell formation. Why was there a second one here? Judging from the other party's aura, she did not have the inviolable and terrifying spiritual pressure of a level 2 powerhouse. "Come here, Bliss." The fireman seemed to have seen through Bliss's doubts. "This is not my main body, but a soul projection. What we need to do today is too important. My main body cannot leave the Flame Monarch, so I can only rely on my soul projection to communicate with you." Feeling the power of the contract emanating from the depths of the other party's soul at such a close distance, Bliss meekly walked in front of the 2 and bowed his head in obedience. "My main body has already told you everything that needs to be said. There's something here that you must bring with you." Saying this, the fireman spread out his hand, revealing 2 strange items on his palm made of crimson flames. a black pearl the size of a pigeon's egg, a metal ball the size of a fist, emitting intense spatial ripples. The black pearl is the deception pearl. Bring it with you when you reach the other side, and it can conceal your identity as an intruder. The metal ball is a simple teleportation spell formation that can only teleport 2 people at a time. Takes about 5 days to recharge. To prevent the spatial ripples from affecting the accuracy of the teleportation when teleporting across dimensions, the void energy inside has been emptied. This also means that if you reach the other side, you will have to survive alone for 5 days. Only when the metal ball is full of energy can you find a safe place to unfold it. When that time comes, you will be able to get our support. Bliss listened respectfully to the fireman's explanation, not daring to miss out on any crucial information. Even though this was the first time he had experienced a plane invasion, he was already familiar with the dangers he would encounter within. Keeping the 2 strange items given to him by his master into his space ring, Bliss swallowed the space ring and carefully checked the items on his body before nodding slightly at the fireman. Stand in the black circle. The beautiful witch who had been busy in the center of the hall finally stopped what she was doing and said coldly to Bliss. Bliss obeyed and stood in it. The witch then began to dance a strange dance around the spell formation, chanting a strange, indecipherable intonation as she danced. Under Alice's guidance, the Tower of Destiny's massive amount of unparalleled magical energy flowed into the spell formation, and a blinding light enveloped the entire astrology platform. The strong light lasted for a full quarter of an hour. When the light gradually dimmed and the astrology platform became visible again, Bliss's figure had completely disappeared. Only the serious-looking fireman and the exhausted Alice were left in the field. "Do you think we will succeed this time?" The fireman sighed softly. "With my void stone as an anchor point, the probability of this interplanar teleportation failing is only 23%. If this guy is really that unlucky, we can try again in a month," Alice said nonchalantly. Ugra Grimm's projection of the fireman was speechless. "Try again? Where am I going to find a second void stone?" As for what would happen to Bliss if the teleportation failed, Grimm hesitated for a moment and did not continue asking. He was really afraid that Alice would say something frightening again. Chapter 494. An endless path of stars extended before his eyes. Blitz felt like he had turned into a lump of mud that anyone could knead as they pleased. Treacherous and unpredictable spatial energy assaulted him from all directions. Thousands of gravitational waves acted on Blitz's frail insect body, immediately tearing him to pieces. Blitz's relatively intact body disintegrated into millions of tiny black beetles, barely gathering into a ball of black smoke, which prevented him from being pulled away by the gravitational wave. If not for the protection of the teleportation spell formation, Blitz would have long since been torn to pieces by the spatial distortions on his body, and then pulled into different parts of the void. This was all thanks to Alice, who was in charge of the teleportation spell formation. If Alice had the strength of a grade 4 being, she would naturally be able to use spatial energy proficiently. That way, the person being teleported would only have to bear a small amount of the spatial energy to successfully teleport across plane. It was a pity that Alice only had the strength of a grade 1 being, and in order to avoid a severe spatial backlash, she had intentionally reduced the defensive capabilities of the teleportation spell formation. Just like that, Blitz, who had been sent out as the vanguard, could only frantically control his undying bug body, using it to dispel the immense pressure he had to bear. It was as though he was traversing a continuously extending path of stars. The black smoke that Blitz had transformed into was sometimes stretched into a long strip, sometimes squeezed into a meat patty, and sometimes twisted into a fried dough twist. On the long path of stars, Blitz was like an unkillable cockroach, enduring all kinds of terrifying abuse. He had no chance to resist at all, and could only endure it in silence. Fortunately, no matter how long the journey was, there would come a day when the end would come. Finally, with the sudden explosion of a strange incantation, a narrow crack suddenly appeared on the path of stars. Through the spatial membrane formed by the plane barrier, Blitz could vaguely see the strange and dazzling continent on the other side of the crack. But before Blitz could hesitate, the layer of starlight wrapped around his body carried him through, rushing into the spatial crack. The grass was green and the sky was blue. Kariak's sky was always so clear. The warm spring breeze blew through the wild grass. Red, blue, purple, yellow. All sorts of flowers were mixed in the lush green grass, looking exceptionally beautiful from afar. However, in the middle of this beautiful painting, a spatial rift less than 2 meters long suddenly split open. As the terrifying void hurricane blew out from the crack, the grass, wildflowers, seeds, and roots were sliced into fine powder as if an invisible razor had cut through it. Then, the powder was instantly scattered into the distance. In the midst of this powder, there were naturally some strange black squirming creatures. The spatial crack only lasted for about 3/4 of a finger before it was restored to its original state by the powerful healing power of the plane. However, in this short period of time, the void hurricanes and space turbulence had already caused massive and irreparable damage to the land. The grass was flattened and the ground began to crack. Strange spatial distortions caused the spacetime here to become somewhat distorted. Any creature that accidentally intruded into this place could be attacked by the spatial distortion and be sucked into the alternate dimension. Without the protection of a powerful force, ordinary creatures would not be able to withstand the abnormal changes in space. The moment they were sucked into the spatial distortion would be the moment their bodies disintegrated and their lives perished. In another region 5 miles away from the teleportation point, Blitz gathered his consciousness with great difficulty, sending out insect language to the surroundings to gather. Finally, after a quarter of an hour, Blitz, who had barely gathered half of his body, crawled out of the bushes with difficulty. In the sparse forest around him, puffs of black smoke were gathering from all directions, once again entering his body. An indescribable pressure and suffocation pressed down on Blitz's heart, making it difficult for him to think normally. The wizard power in his body was suppressed to the point where it was difficult for him to use it. If not for the fact that he had the immortal worm body and did not need to rely on the air of the outside world to sustain his life, even taking deep breaths here would have been a luxury. Plain suppression. Blitz instantly understood what he was facing. He had already arrived in another plane, so what he was facing now was the constant suppression of the plane's consciousness. He had already expected such a situation before he set off. It opened its ugly mouth and spat out a simple and unadorned spatial ring. Then, it put it on its thick left pinky finger. Blitz chanted the spell incantation, taking 5 fingers to retrieve the deception pearl and the metal ball from the ring. In the Magus world, he would only need a thought to retrieve the items from the space ring. But here, he had spent 5 fingers' worth of time. The moment the spell was completed, Blitz felt the wizard power in his body visibly drain away. Such an insignificant process consumed very little mana. In the Magus world, he could absorb the drifting elemental energy in the space to replenish his mana in an insignificant amount of time. But here, he could only feel his wizard power draining away, not replenishing it. Blitz's expression changed slightly, and he closed his eyes to sense the surroundings. With his Magus rank spiritual force, he could still sense the existence of the drifting elemental energy in the space. However, his spiritual force estimated that the concentration of elemental particles here was only 16% of the Magus world. With such a thin concentration of elemental particles, a Magus passive absorption was no longer enough to maintain the recovery of wizard power. If he wanted to recover his wizard power, he would probably have to enter deep meditation to truly replenish it. Damned low magic world, Blitz cursed in anger, and picked up the deception pearl. The moment the pearl touched his insect body, Blitz could clearly feel the plane suppression lessen by more than half, and even his breathing became smoother. Blitz thought for a moment, then opened his mouth and swallowed the deception orb. This thing had to come into contact with his body to take effect. Swallowing it would be safe, and he could come into full contact with it. Why not? Blitz then grabbed the metal ball with his brownish-yellow insect tentacles and looked at it. The 5 crystals embedded on the side were all dim, and only the first one was flashing rhythmically, looking no different from a human breathing. This thing could not be placed into the space ring, or else it would never be able to absorb the void energy it required. Blitz hesitated for a moment, then used his insect tentacles to tear open the carapace on his chest with difficulty, burying the metal ball within. At this moment, there was a strange sound of earth being drilled in the forest. Immediately, 15 stinger scorpions the size of mastiffs broke out of the soil and crawled in front of Blitz. With you all, I have the entire world. Blitz looked at his powerful insect army with satisfaction. With a wave of his insect tentacles, he led them into the depths of the forest. Half a day later, just as the surroundings of the teleportation point had calmed down, a strange noise suddenly broke the silence. Soon after, a strange black dot flew over at high speed, sticking close to the bottom of the clouds. As the black dot grew larger and clearer, it turned out to be a crudely made strange aircraft that made one's hair stand on end. This was an ugly gnome helicopter made mainly of light and sturdy wood, with mechanical gears as its core component. The body of the gnome helicopter was made to look like a gnome's head, with a layer of yellow paint on the outside. There was a 4-wing propeller made of metal blades on the body. The terrifying noise just now was caused by the crazy rotation of this huge propeller, which stirred the air. The belly of this gnome helicopter wasn't big, and could only fit one ordinary human. However, when the gnome helicopter landed on the devastated land, 2 little gnomes wearing vests, leather pants, leather boots, and goggles jumped out from the belly of the helicopter. Stepping on the barren, hard soil where no green could be seen at all, Old Man Talk lit his pipe. After circling around the teleportation point for a while, he couldn't help but curse. Damn it, my eyelids have been twitching since yesterday. I knew that something bad would happen today. Damn it, damn it, damn it. Mosedin, hurry up, go back to the village and tell the others that there might be some alien plane monsters nearby. Tell them to be careful. The one who spoke was an old gnome who seemed to be in his 40s. Compared to humans, this age was equivalent to that of an 80-year-old old man. On the other hand, Mosedin, who came with him, was just a 7 or 8-year-old gnome. He looked young and immature and was not afraid at all. Father Torque, how did you find out that there's a monster? Mosedin also followed Father Torque for a few rounds, but he didn't find any abnormal traces. The grassland within a radius of half a mile around the teleportation point had been leveled, and fine debris was thrown a few miles away. Even if there were any traces, they might have been annihilated by the violent nether storm. Therefore, he was very curious about the basis of Father Torque's judgment. However, at the next moment, his forehead was hit hard by the big smoking pipe. What proof do you need? Can't you see that the dimensional barrier was broken by someone from the outside? This is not a place where the space is weak, and there can't be a natural space hole here. Someone must have broken in. The more Father Torque spoke, the angrier he became. He waved his big smoking pipe and wanted to attack again, but the little gnome Mosedin had already dodged away. Maybe that monster has already been destroyed by the nether storm, Mosedin retorted angrily as he climbed up the gnome helicopter with difficulty. Didn't you say that very few creatures could survive in the nether storm? Father Torque hesitated for a while. He shaded his eyes with his hand as he glanced at the lush jungle in the distance and couldn't help but mutter, "It'd be great if the other party really died in the nether storm. What I'm worried about is, if the other party didn't die, then it would be our disaster. None of the fellas that could enter our world from the nether storm are easy to deal with." Chapter 495. Bliss was still wandering in the depths of the forest. Due to the existence of the plane's suppression, his basic strength was at an extremely low level. This also caused the side effects of the ultra-long-distance teleportation between planes to not be completely eliminated until now. Previously, he didn't understand why Master would choose him, a semi-summoning worm wizard, to be the Pathfinder instead of Mary and Sabrina, who were battle wizards. However, he now knew the reason very clearly. The terror of long-distance teleportation made him shudder even now when he thought about it. Although he had the guidance and protection of the spell formation, the layers of spatial distortions and fragments of space could still lead to his own death if he wasn't careful. When that damned Alice irresponsibly broke through the barrier of the goblin plane and threw him in, the so-called defensive spell formation and personal protection didn't even have a trace of it. If Bliss didn't have the undying worm body and used a part of his body to resist the invasion of the space-time force on his core and soul, he would have been blown into pieces by the violent void hurricane. Even so, his undying worm body had completely disintegrated at the last moment. After that, it took a lot of effort to gather what was left of his body back together. Bliss finally understood his master's painstaking efforts. He was chosen to be the vanguard because of the undying worm body. If it were Madame Mary, even if her battle strength was a few times higher than his, her adaptability and survivability would definitely not be as good as Bliss in such a disastrous situation. Bliss felt a little proud, but his attention was quickly attracted by his rumbling stomach. His body was severely damaged, and he was extremely lacking in energy. It seemed like he had to find some food. With the 15 thorny scorpion battle bugs, Bliss hunted for food without restraint in this rainforest that resembled the Amazon rainforest. Be it rabbits, guinea pigs, jackals, wolves, tigers, or leopards, as long as they entered Bliss's life force detection range, they would not be able to escape from the thorny scorpion battlebug's earth element attack. The 15 thorny scorpion battlebugs were like 15 invisible demons, traversing the underground that was densely covered with plant root. Every time it discovered a target, it would silently lurk under them and then suddenly use its earth spear to deal a fatal blow to the enemy. If the stealthy attack didn't kill the enemy, the stinger scorpion would emerge from the ground and use its terrifying jaws to bite the enemy's throat, causing the enemy to bleed to death. If it didn't wish for the other party to struggle too much and attract new enemies, the stinger scorpion would inject an excessive amount of earth elemental energy through its stinger, causing them to die in despair and paralysis. Of course, Bliss did not have Grimm's ability to quickly analyze the laws of the plane, so his method of dispelling the plane's suppression was simple and crude. That was eating. Only when he was full would he have the strength to resist the suppression of this plane. Once he devoured enough native life, he would be able to absorb enough life factors from the other party's body, and then use them to change the characteristics of the life he revealed to the outside world. This was actually a camouflage ability that most predators possessed. As a typical predator of flesh and blood, Bliss was even more outstanding in this aspect. In the lush forest, in the dark forest filled with branches, vines and bushes, Bliss, who was wearing a thick black cloak and staggering forward, was like the incarnation of the god of death. Wherever he went, he turned the place into a land of death. Under Bliss's command, any life force captured by his spiritual senses would not be able to escape the massacre of the thorny scorpion battlebug. Behind him, the forest that had been brimming with life had now become a land of death. Apart from a few insects and microorganisms the size of a fingernail that survived the thorny scorpion army's sweep of the forest, all other living things that could be seen had been thoroughly and meticulously cleaned up. And through this massacre, Bliss could feel the planar plane's suppression on him weakening. Without the support of these living things, the plane's consciousness had fewer and fewer carriers to rely on, and its ability to suppress the invader Bliss would inevitably weaken. With Bliss's knowledge of witchcraft, it was obvious that he could not see through the plane's consciousness. but instinctively, he could sense that the more native creatures he killed, the faster he killed, and the weaker the planar suppression that had been stacking on him would be. With this simple understanding, Bliss, who had never had any standards of good or evil, began to kill without restraint. But just as he was commanding the thorny scorpion battle-bugs to trap the 3 wind wolves in a cave, a loud noise that streaked across the sky attracted his attention. Through the gaps between the dense leaves, Bliss repeatedly adjusted his compound eye mode and finally caught a glimpse of a strange creation. A strange alchemy flying machine and 2 weak soul undulations. Giving up on commanding the thorny scorpion battle-bugs and letting them fight the wind wolves, Bliss carefully observed this strange combination through the lush greenery. Before he had crossed plains, Master Grimm had specially fed him with a lot of knowledge and things to take note of regarding planar wars. The first thing he had to do after crossing was to disguise himself. The second was to quickly understand the racial composition of the plane and blend in with the local intelligent races. The third was to find a way to contact the race that dominated the plane and find out their strengths and weaknesses to make use of. Bliss only had a vague impression of this plane. This was a small plane dominated by goblins. Goblins? How could such a greedy, weak, and stupid person occupy a plane? Bliss could not believe his ears when he first heard this news. But when he thought of the cunning Kirby by his master's side, Bliss had to admit that the green-skinned goblins had their ways. At the very least, in the eyes of Master Grimm, the green-skinned goblin Kirby had a higher status than him. He was a terrifying insect wizard, and yet his status was lower than that of a stupid and cowardly green-skinned goblin. Although he was unwilling to accept this reality, Bliss could not lie to his heart. Because this was reality. Now that he saw the strange flying device, Bliss had a vague idea of what was going on. If this plane was filled with naked, weak goblins wielding wooden bows and short spears, Bliss could rely on his insect army to crush the enemy without any reinforcements. But now the 2 stupid goblins, who were so weak that they couldn't even be compared to beginner apprentices, could actually fly into the sky with the help of a strange alchemy item. This proved that the goblins did not match the symbol in Bliss's mind at all. If he was really stupid enough to attack them openly, the sad scene of the great Lord Worm Wizard being chased around by a bunch of weak goblins might really happen. The flying device that the 2 goblins were riding on was extremely fast. Bliss estimated that it could reach a speed of 15 to 20 meters per second. This speed was comparable to a wizard's flying speed with the help of the flight spell. However, on one side, there were ordinary goblins that could not be detected, and on the other side, there were sorcerers who had great power. If the enemy could use some tricks to make the weak goblins display the power of a sorcerer, then it would be very difficult to complete this invasion. Just as Bliss was silently thinking about his plan, the cruel and bloody massacre ended. The 3 thorn scorpions killed the 3 adult wind wolves at the cost of light injuries. The goblin plane was indeed a low magic plane. Even after searching the entire forest, there were very few magical creatures. No matter how many normal beasts there were, they could not cause physical damage to the thorn scorpions. These 3 wind wolves were rare magical creatures that had the ability to control the wind element. It was the violent wind blades that they unleashed before dying that caused some obvious physical damage to the thorn scorpions. A stinger scorpion's back carapace was hacked by the torrential storm of wind blades, leaving behind 7 to 8 scratches. Some of them had already cut through the carapace, causing purplish-black insect blood to flow out. But as the injured thorn scorpion feasted, the wounds were healing and recovering at a speed visible to the naked eye. With a soft whistle, the remaining thorn scorpions that had scattered into the surrounding forest rushed back. The black-robed Bliss led them towards the direction where the mysterious flying device had disappeared. Before engaging in a direct confrontation, Bliss felt that he needed to understand the other party first. And as a worm wizard, the only way he could understand the other party was through eating. Beta Town was a goblin town adjacent to a large forest. The people living here were naturally a group of lively and adorable green-skinned goblins. There were many other races in the town as well, but most of them were slaves, enslaved and ordered around by the goblins. The buildings in Beta Town were not very tall, which obviously had something to do with the height of the goblins. The building materials used were mostly large pieces of metal, which made Beta Town look bright from afar, giving off a sense of toughness and blood. The round mushroom house was covered with a layer of solid metal mezzanine. It had a thick metal door, a disc-shaped roof and skylight, and white steam that filled the air above the town. Chapter 496. This was a remote town ruled by goblins. Blitz hid at the edge of the forest, constantly adjusting the scanning mode of his compound eyes as he meticulously and comprehensively analyzed the peculiarities of this goblin town. There was a 3-meter-tall earthen wall on the outskirts of the town, and a small observation tower was built at the corner. A few goblin warriors stood on top of it, holding strange cylinders in their hands as they scanned the surroundings for any signs of activity. In the town, there were many strange races entering and exiting, and most of them were much taller than the goblin guards. Their common characteristic was a metal ring made of a special material on their neck. And if they disobeyed or got into a conflict with the goblin guards only had to press a strange button on their wrists, and those big guys would be struck down with electric sparks. Then, they would naturally be beaten with whips and iron rods. Blitz was slightly stunned. Were these the weak goblins he knew? Since when did these green-skinned goblins become so cruel and vicious? Could it be that they relied on those strange electric shock collars to control the other races? Then how did they defeat the goblins and put on the collars? Countless questions arose in Blitz's mind, but they were quickly answered by another scene he saw. Just as Blitz was hiding in the forest, a deafening roar and ear-piercing noise came from another direction, accompanied by slight tremors on the ground. It seemed like some large creature was moving over there. Blitz hesitated for a moment, and led the insect army over cautiously. It was a small camp established in the forest. The center of the camp was filled with thick logs that had just been chopped down, each of them as thick as 2 people's arms. At the edge of the camp were 5 3-meter-tall, 700-kilogram humanoid logging robots hard at work. And sitting on the control panel of the logging robots, controlling them to chop down the tall trees, were the short green-skinned goblins. Alchemy puppets or magic war avatars. Metallic humanoid shells, huge chains, gears, and all sorts of propeller shafts, exaggerated metal chainsaws, and steam rising from the back of the robots. It turned out that the deafening roar they heard earlier was the noise made by the giant as it spat out steam as it strode forward, and the ear-piercing sound was the terrifying sound of a high-speed chainsaw cutting through a tree trunk. Trees that were more than 20 meters tall and needed 2 people to wrap their arms around collapsed under the ear-piercing sound of chainsaws. Then, the gnomes controlled the logging robots and used a few strokes to clear all the obstructing branches on the tree trunk. Only then did he use a pair of large mechanical hands to carry the log to the rear of the camp. The 5 busying logging robots obviously had different tasks. 2 of them were in charge of cutting down trees, 1 was in charge of cleaning the tree trunks, and the other 2 were in charge of transporting the trees. Under the control of a few gnome operators, their tasks were clear and orderly, completely displaying a different kind of powerful force. The large slaves that Billis had seen in the small town were also here. Under the command of the gnome guards, they carried the logs into the large houses and onto the operating table of the cutting machine. Amidst the ear-piercing sounds of cutting, the logs were cut into planks of appropriate size, and finally loaded onto the truck to be transported away. After watching the entire process, Billis finally understood that this was only a small logging field ruled by the green-skinned goblins. Those rumbling machines were not the goblins' battle machines, but merely tools for them to cut down trees. At this point, the gloominess in Blitz's heart deepened. Seriously speaking, these gnomes before him were probably the lowest level of cannon fodder in the so-called Great Goblin Empire. If even this bunch of cannon fodder were equipped with the terrifying Hercules, then the basic strength of the great Goblin Empire was easy to deduce. This was only a small plane, and the ones ruling the entire plane were just a bunch of weak and stupid gnomes. However, Billis suddenly had an ominous premonition. This plane did not seem to be as easy to deal with as he'd expected. However, as a worm wizard from the sorcerer world, Billis naturally would not be intimidated by such a small difficulty. He made up his mind and lurked deep into the forest. He began to send out some meticulously bred insects to sneak into the gnomes' logging field. Damp woodland, lush tall trees and annoying shrubs filled the area. Tree vines and thorns that were difficult to cut filled up the space between the trees. The camp was extremely humid, and it was accompanied by ear-piercing noises. It was simply a dream to sleep well in such an environment. Thus, even if Oldham used cotton balls to plug his ears, he could not fall asleep from the terrifying sounds of the chainsaws and the tremors of the tall trees falling to the ground. As he cursed under his breath, Oldham got off his bed and put on his heavy metal boot. He then opened the tent door and made his way out. "Oh, Commander, you're finally awake. That Dad Tokay has come to see you twice. It seems that he has something very important to report to you." The guard who was on sentry duty at the entrance of the tent roared loudly in a funny tone in Zhang Tai's ears. Oldham was the commander of this camp. The 5 gnome logging machines were under his command. Thus, he had become a green-skinned fellow whose position was even higher than the mayor of Beta Town. Oldham shook his head. Only then did he remember that he had sent old Torque to investigate the strange phenomenon in the distance half a day ago. The strange sound that shook the heaven and earth could be clearly felt from tens of miles away. For no reason, Oldham felt a sense of guilt and shortness of breath. Under the guidance of an inexplicable thought, he immediately sent out his most capable gnome helicopter to investigate. Now that the other party had come back to report, they must have found something special. With that thought, Oldham immediately strode into a wooden hall in the middle of the camp. As expected, old Torque was pacing around the wooden table anxiously, while the gnome apprentice Mosidin was sitting at the side with a blank look, as if he had not figured out the situation yet. "Speak, old Torque." Commander Oldham strode into the wooden hall and sat in front of the wooden table. He looked at old Torque with a solemn expression. "What news did you bring me this time?" "Respected Sir Commander, the news I brought back this time might not be good news." Tock's dad took off his goggles and grabbed his leather hat with a hesitant look. "Speak, I'm listening." Oldham's heart sank. I suspect, that some otherworldly monsters have already invaded our world." Old Man Torque tightened his leather hat as he finally voiced out his thoughts. The commander abruptly stood up. A nervous expression immediately appeared on his green face, which was covered with beige spots. He asked in rapid succession, "What monster is it? What kind of strength? Are there many of them?" Old Torque said awkwardly, "We didn't see anything when we went there. We only saw a forest that was destroyed after it went out of control." "You didn't see anything? Then the monsters you mentioned." "Although we didn't see anything, based on my many years of experience, I can feel that there's a trace of evil that doesn't belong to our world." Commander Oldham sat down again with a hesitant look on his face. As an old gnome warrior that had followed him for a long time, old Torque had rich experience that other gnomes could not reach. Therefore, there was no reason for him to ignore his report. However, without any evidence, how could he report to the higher-ups? While he was hesitating, the noise of the slaves came from outside the camp. "What happened?" Oldham roared angrily. A guard at the door ran in and reported, report, a monster came to the camp. It killed 2 slaves." Hearing the word monster, Oldham's heart trembled. He immediately drew his short-handled gnome musket from his waist and strode out. Tock's father and Mosidin followed him out of the wooden hall. At this time, the southwest corner of the camp was in a mess. 20 to 30 troll slaves were running around in panic. Behind them was a strange scorpion the size of a mastiff. At the edge of the camp further away, the corpses of 3 troll slaves were lying there. Their throats were badly mangled, and it was obvious that they had lost their lives. The moment Oldham and the other gnomes rushed out, the sound of muskets rang out in the camp. 7 to 8 gnome guards guarding the camp had already raised their muskets and fired at the strange scorpion. Oldham could clearly see that the metal pellets were propelled by the explosion and shot at the body of the strange scorpion at a speed that was hard to catch with the naked eye. However, something happened that almost made him scream. Without exception, the metal pellets bounced off the strange scorpion's black carapace. The parts of the strange scorpion that were shot would either leave a deep dent or a deep scratch, but none of the pellets penetrated the scorpion's carapace. Furthermore, the pellets that bounced off even knocked down 2 troll slaves who were running away in panic. The scorpion that was attacked became even more enraged. A layer of yellow smoke rose from its body, and its body suddenly disappeared in the smoke. When it reappeared, it was already beside a gnome guard 20 meters away. Crack! The terrifying scorpion actually used its huge jaws to bite off the gnome guard's right leg. Even the gnome guard's metal armor that was half a finger thick could not withstand the terrifying bite. It was forcefully swallowed by the scorpion. Damn it, the gnome muskets could not hurt it at all. Quick, get the logging machines back for me. Chapter 497. Under the control of the gnomes, the 5 loggers brandished their chainsaws and iron fists, taking heavy steps that shook the earth as they charged at the strange insect. The strange insect had been completely unrestrained just a moment ago, but when it saw the metal lumps spitting hot steam as they charged at it, it immediately turned into a cunning fox and began to hide everywhere in the sawmill. The logs piled up like a mountain after being chopped became the best cover for it. Compared to the loggers, the strange insect was only as big as their thick feet. If it was trampled by such a huge thing, no matter how tenacious its life force was or how tough its carapace was, it would not be able to resist the terrifying weight of 40 tons. Thus, the strange insect used the piles of logs in the middle of the camp to charge left and right, occasionally launching a sneak attack on the troll slaves and gnome guards who could not dodge in time. The sawmill camp immediately descended into chaos. All of the troll slaves covered their heads and fled. In their panic, some of them ran into the alien insects and became the targets of their slaughter. Some of them sent themselves into the path of the fast-moving logging machines and were then stomped into meat paste after a short, shrill wail. The group of goblin guards that Obolum led were thrown into disarray by the rampaging slaves, and they couldn't catch up to the nimble and strong figures of the alien insects. All gnomes, don't panic. Alb was the commander of the camp after all. Even at a time like this, he was still calmer than the other gnomes. He climbed onto a tall wooden chopping block and roared, "All gnome guards, get on the chopping block! You lumberjacks, don't chase after them. Guard the entrance to the camp. All slaves, gather at the houses. If anyone dares to run, kill them." Under Alb's command, the chaotic camp immediately gained a backbone. All of the slaves and gnome guards ran to their respective positions as ordered. The 5 loggers no longer chased after the strange insect, instead retreating to guard the entrance between the piles of logs. They watched covetously, waiting for the other party to walk right into their trap. That thorn scorpion suddenly stopped between 2 piles of logs and raised its body, as if it was listening to something. Soon, it changed its strategy. It rushed out of the pile of logs and began to attack the huge wooden boxes in the middle of the camp. Under its lure, 2 goblin lumberjacks rushed into the pile of logs, swinging their chainsaws and cutting everything inside into pieces. The logs were chopped until sawdust flew everywhere, and the big wooden box was chopped until it was crooked. Wooden boxes were knocked over one by one, and the contents inside were scattered all over the place. It was a strange crystal prism that was more than half a meter long. It didn't seem to be solid inside, but was filled with a strange liquid that emitted a dark green light. For some reason, even though he could not sense any elemental aura from them, Bliss, who was hiding in the forest far away, felt his heart skip a beat. He suddenly felt that the object that meant the most to him in this camp was not the 5 goblin lumberjacks, nor was it the fire stick in the gnome's hands. Instead, it was these mysterious and strange crystal prism. Under his command, that stinger scorpion's surroundings immediately stirred up a misty earthen yellow mist, and it even more so dove into the ground. When it once again emerged from the ground, it had already run to the side of the overturned crystal prism. "Open fire! Open fire!" Alb's shrill roar sounded again. "Don't let the monster get close to the magic energy battery. Hurry and open fire!" Under his shout, all of the gnome guards perched on top of the logs raised their guns and opened fire at the thorn scorpion. The dense metal bullets struck the thorn scorpion's black carapace, and most of them bounced back. However, the thorn scorpion's body also emitted a few purplish-black pillars of blood, and many of its compound eyes were blinded. Shrill insect hisses resounded in the battlefield, and all the gnomes covered their ears and rolled on the ground in pain. Even the gnome mechanics on the 5 goblin lumberjacks were no exception. Bliss, who was hiding in the distance, was slightly stunned, and then seemed to understand something. Truthfully speaking, Bliss was completely shocked when he first saw the 5 goblin lumberjack. With his sharp spiritual force, he could sense that these goblin lumberjacks all had the basic strength of a high-ranked acolyte. This place seemed to be a rather remote town in the wilderness of the great goblin empire. The cylindrical poles in the gnome guards' hands that could fire metal bullets had a basic attack power of 30 degrees. This might not mean much to Magi, but if every gnome at the bottom of the Goblin Empire had such a simple and swift attack method, Bliss would have to re-evaluate the overall strength of the Goblin Empire. If even this place could casually produce 5 high-ranked acolytes, and every single one of them had the attack power of a beginner acolyte, this would not be good news for the Magi's invasion of the plane. However, there were good and bad things in everything. Although the combat attainments and attack power of these gnomes made him secretly apprehensive, the thorn scorpion's painful hisses also exposed the weakness of this group of gnomes. Their strength seemed to rely on these strange equipment, and their own strength was so insignificant that it was not even worth mentioning. The thorn scorpion's pained hisses had a sound wave intensity of only 15 degrees, but the gnomes present were already swaying left and right, unable to control themselves. This showed that their bodies were not even as strong as a beginner acolyte, and their vitality and spiritual force must be very low. Taking advantage of the fact that the gnomes were dizzy, the injured thorn scorpion once again created a cloud of dust that covered a radius of 5 meters, and then burrowed into the ground, never to be seen again. It took the gnomes a long time to regain their senses, and they immediately organized people to search the entire camp, but they could not find any traces of the strange insect. They had no choice but to give up on the search, and began to restore order in the lumberjack camp. As the entire camp had been turned into a pile of mud, many piles of logs had been smashed by the lumberjacks, and many wooden boxes had been smashed into pieces. Thus, as they struggled to organize everything, almost none of the gnomes realized that 2 of the scattered crystal prisms had mysteriously disappeared. Just as the gnomes turned out in full force to search the camp and the surrounding forest, Bliss had already returned to the depths of the forest with the thorn scorpion war beetles, and only left 1 or 2 insect scouts around the camp. After finding a hidden cave in the forest, Bliss immediately began to study the 2 strange objects he had just obtained. Magic batteries? These 2 strange little things were called magic batteries? Judging from their names, they seemed to be a special kind of energy crystal that could provide mysterious non-elemental energy to certain special equipment. Bliss was already so shocked that he could not close his mouth when he saw how the weak gnomes could control metal puppets that were 20 times their size with ease. What he was most surprised about was what kind of energy these huge creatures relied on to move. After all, he did not sense any elemental energy aura from them. And now, with 2 magic energy batteries in his hands and sensing the strange energy frequency within, Bliss had a vague feeling that those big guys were probably powered by these so-called magic energy batteries. However, this place lacked an alchemy laboratory, and he did not know much about alchemy. Thus, it was impossible for Bliss to decipher the strange system of the gnomes from these 2 magic batteries. Thus, Bliss could only shift his attention back to the gnome camp in an attempt to find more comprehensive information. What Bliss did not know was that while he was hiding in the cave to study the magic batteries, a gnome helicopter suddenly rose from the lumberjack and flew into the distance under the cover of the night. Even though the battle during the day had caught the gnome commander off guard and they did not find any valuable information or clues, Oldman Torque's information gave him sufficient reason to suspect that the strange insects that broke into the camp today were the minions of the Otherworld invaders. But combined with the information brought back by Old Talk, Obum had sufficient reason to suspect that the insects that broke into the camp today were the minions of the otherworldly invaders. Thus, after sending more guards to stand guard at the lumberjack camp, Obum personally wrote a letter requesting for help to Old Talk and asked him to bring it to Barzik, the commander of the 7th Gnomes Land Corps 170 miles away. In the letter, Obum used a tone that made the gnomes' blood run cold to describe the terror of the otherworldly invaders, and once again described the weakness of Beta Town's defenses. After Old Talk and the flying apprentice Mozadin left the camp in the gnome helicopter, Commander Obum stood in front of the wooden window of the 2-story building, gazing at the silent forest under the cover of the night. His heart was filled with indescribable fear and worry. Such a forest was definitely not normal. Usually, large numbers of beasts and monsters would appear around the camp at night. Even if the gnome guards had set up blazing torches around the perimeter of the camp, they would not be able to stop them from circling around under the cover of the night. But today, the forest under the cover of the night was deathly silent. It was as if countless terrifying demons were lurking in the darkness, and the beasts in the forest were either scared off or killed by them. This also meant that the insect that had caused trouble in the camp during the day had not gone far, and was still spying on them. Once the gnome guards let their guard down, or if there was a huge flaw in the camp's defenses, the insect would definitely return and wreak havoc in the lumberjack camp once more. Chapter 498. At daybreak, reinforcements from the lumberyard arrived. 378 goblin warriors rode on a type of mount called the chocobo and crossed hundreds of miles at an astonishing speed to reach the lumberyard. Along with them was a goblin airship, 3 goblin tanks, and 12 fell reavers that were even larger and more powerful than the logging robots. From the outside, the goblin airship looked like a wooden sailboat flying in the blue sky. However, the exterior of the airship was covered with bronze panels. The reason the airship was able to float was not because of supernatural powers, but because of a huge leather bag filled with a mysterious gas. In order to make the goblin airship look cooler, the goblins drew a colorful shark on the floating leather bag of the airship. Then, they used alloy chains to tie the leather bag and the airship together. This way, the goblin airship could use the huge buoyancy of the leather bag to soar freely in the sky. Not only could the goblin airship be used as a means of transportation, but it was also equipped with 4 to 5 powerful magic cannons. Thus, it had the ability to attack both air and ground. As for the goblin tanks, they were just metal war chariots with magic cannons installed. The 4 wide metal wheels were more than 2 meters tall, and the thick and cumbersome war chariot had limited space inside, so it could only fit 3 goblins at the same time. A goblin commander, an artillery gunner, and an observer. Even though it did not carry many people, with its sturdy body and powerful cannons, it was still a terrifying magic machine that no one dared to underestimate. However, the core of the entire goblin army were the 12 fell reavers. From the outside, the fell reavers looked like metal puppets that were 6 meters tall. They had a head, torso, and limbs like humans. But unlike the logging robots, The Fell Reavers were full-body combat magic machines, and the goblin machinist who operated them hid in the thick torso. On the other hand, the logging robots were half-body engineering magic machines. In order to allow the goblins to see their surroundings clearly, they did not have an upper body like the Fell Reavers. Instead, the chest area was a semi-open control platform. Thus, the goblins who operated the logging robots were vulnerable to long-range attacks from their enemies, but the Fell Reavers did not have such a problem. The sudden influx of such a large group of goblins immediately caused a huge commotion in the lumberyard. Of course, the abnormalities here didn't escape Bliss's detection. Hence, after a quarter of an hour, Bliss led the scorpion war beetles back to the vicinity of the goblin camp and observed the situation from afar. He didn't have to wait for long. An hour later, a group of goblins in bright armor boarded the goblin airship floating in the forest. The silent campsite once again became noisy. With the goblin airship as the center, 3 goblin tanks and 12 Fell Reavers spread out in a straight line, charging into the forest like an unstoppable steel chariot. While advancing at high speed, the goblin tanks continued to fire, spitting out mana fireballs from the mana cannons. Wherever the mana fireball landed, it would cause an earth-shattering explosion, followed by violent flame shockwaves. Even the tall trees that needed 2 people to wrap their arms around couldn't withstand the explosion of a magical fireball at close range. Hence, as the goblin tanks continued to fire as they advanced, the forest in front of the goblin marines was instantly engulfed in flames, with splinters flying everywhere. Tall ancient trees creaked in pain as they fell, and then were pushed aside by the logging robots with brute force. Behind the goblin tanks, logging robots and Fell Reavers were groups of goblin warriors riding on chocobos. They sat astride the backs of the chocobos, holding goblin muskets in their hands. Once they noticed any unusual movements in the forest, they would immediately unleash a barrage of bullets. Some of the pheasants, leopards and horned sheep living in the bushes immediately became the most miserable targets. They were frightened by the deafening mana cannons and fled for their lives, but as soon as they left the forest, they were shredded to pieces by metal bullets. Their flesh and blood soaked the black soil of the forest, but before the blood could seep into the soil, huge metal feet stomped down. When he lifted his feet again, there was a puddle of sticky and disgusting blood paste between his feet and the ground that had been stirred. What were the goblins trying to do? Could it be that they were planning to flatten the entire forest? Blitz's gaze pierced through the sparse trees and landed on the Steel Legion that was advancing in an orderly fashion. They were clearly just a bunch of weak goblins, but when they hid amongst the tall and sturdy magical machinery, their terrifying aura that could kill anyone in their way was a little troublesome for Blitz. The goblin muskets only had a base attack of 30 degrees, which was similar to the attack of a beginner apprentice in the sorcerer world. The mana cannons that were firing wildly had an energy intensity of 70 degrees, which was already at the level of a quasi-sorcerer. Normally, such an attack would not be able to threaten a worm shaman like Blitz. But no matter how small the damage, it could not withstand the sheer number of enemies. Once Blitz appeared within the attack range of the goblin marines, a concentrated barrage could heavily injure his undying worm body. The undying worm body did not mean that he was truly immortal. Blitz relied more on the splitting of his worm body to disguise the damage he received. Therefore, every time he was injured, a part of his worm body would disintegrate and carry away the damage he received. Since he was chosen as the vanguard of the plane invasion, Master Grimm had rewarded him with a Berserk rune. This could allow his worm soldiers to explode with twice their original strength for a short period of time. But during the Berserk period, these worm soldiers would only attack the enemies around them in a frenzy and would not listen to Blitz's remote commands. That was something that was rather regrettable. That was why Blitz's current priority was to hide, investigate, and wait for backup instead of foolishly fighting the natives with his life. Therefore, when Blitz discovered the goblin's actions, He could only regretfully lead his worm soldiers into the depths of the forest and make a detour towards Beta Town. On the Goblin airship that was floating nearly 100 meters in the air, the 7th Goblin Marine Regiment's commander, Barzik, was leading a group of Goblin officers on the side of the ship, constantly scanning the forest with a monocular in his hand, beating the grass to startle the snake, using violent and ferocious attacks to turn the forest into a sea of flames, forcing the terrifying otherworld invaders out. Once they were exposed to the Goblin Steel Army, what awaited them would be a torrential storm of magical fireballs. But it was a pity that no matter how much they tormented the forest, they never found any traces of the worm soldiers. Instead, they accidentally injured countless forest beasts. Even the incomparably ferocious black bears and giant apes would not be able to pass through the dense barrage of bullets. The reason why the green-skinned goblins could become the rulers of the entire plain could be seen from their proficient control of magical machinery and their powerful magical weapons. When the plain lacked magical elements, and the quantity and quality of magical creatures were not enough to threaten the goblin tribe, the green-skinned goblins relied on their powerful engineering and alchemy skills to skillfully use various magical machinery to become the owners and rulers of this plane. In front of them, ordinary creatures that lacked supernatural powers simply did not have the ability to resist them. Be it barbarians, trolls, humans or other intelligent beings, they could only bow before the goblin warriors armed with live ammunition, becoming lowly slaves who dug for them and managed the plantations. As for civilization, in this plane there was only the goblin civilization. As for the other civilizations, they had already been blasted into fragments that could not be pieced together amidst the rumbling explosions of magical fireballs, finally buried in the surging tides of history. Relying on their powerful magical machinery, the cowardly and foolish goblins that were once sung of by countless people turned over and became masters, oppressing the other races instead and trampling on them. Bending over to watch the goblin marines charge forward wildly, Commander Barzik's heart filled with indescribable pride and excitement. If not for the fact that he was 100 meters in the air, he would have pulled out his bronze pistol and fired a few shots at the sky. But due to the restraint of goblin nobility, he suppressed the restlessness in his heart and frowned at a Bame beside him. "Hey, country bumpkin, where's the invader you spoke of? Are they hiding underground and not daring to come out? But you swore that they were near the camp, and now where are they?" As the only goblin legion within 1,000 miles, Barzik's status as commander was unrivaled in the Kariak region. Moreover, Commander Barzik had led the 7th Goblin Marine Regiment through hundreds of battles, annihilating one slave rebel army after another. That was why there were rows of small and exquisite badges of honor pinned on the chest of his well-ironed uniform. And each of these badges had been dyed red with the blood of hundreds and thousands of slaves. Hearing Barzik's impolite question, a Bame could only smile and bow. "Lord Barzik, it must be because the army you lead is too powerful, that's why they fled." He hadn't finished speaking when Alb's voice suddenly stopped. His small eyes that were like mung beans were opened wide as he gazed towards a certain place behind Bask. At the end of the horizon, a huge cloud of black smoke was rising, and one could vaguely see flames soaring into the sky. And the place where the black smoke and flames were rising was Beta Town. Chapter 499. The once bustling Beta Town had now become a blood-soaked slaughterhouse. The rapidly turning Goblin airship flew 50 meters in the air, slowly reaching the sky above Beta Town. The goblins couldn't bear to look at the horrifying scene below. The town wasn't big, with only 7 or 8 intersecting streets. However, there were many shops and small shops along the streets, most of which were weapon shops, blacksmiths, and alchemy shops. Normally, this would be the golden time when pedestrians would be weaving in and out, and the shops would be loudly advertising. But now the streets were littered with gnomes and slaves who had their limbs severed. The doors of the shops along the streets were wide open, and it was also a mess inside. Dark red bloodstains could be seen everywhere, and corpses that had been gnawed beyond recognition. The blacksmiths and alchemy shops had been set on fire. Fierce flames spewed out of the shops, madly licking at everything that could be burned. Although the goblin buildings had mostly been fitted with metal panels to increase their defense, and many of the core parts were made entirely out of metal components. Unfortunately, in front of the all-devouring sea of fire, everything was turned to ashes. Master Beirut is still in the alchemy shop. Abame's pained wails came from the goblin airship. Beirut was the only high-level goblin engineer in Beta Town. If the logging robot had any mechanical problems, only he could repair it. So seeing the alchemy shop also fall into a fierce sea of fire, Abame felt so much pain that he wanted to die. Looking at the raging flames below, the goblin airship could only adjust its direction from time to time, nimbly passing through the pillars of fire and suffocating black smoke. The attack on Beta Town only lasted for half an hour, but the damage it caused was fatal. That damned enemy seemed to be extremely familiar with this town. After killing their way in from the entrance, they went straight down the streets to the alchemy shop. Then, after slaughtering the alchemy shop and blacksmiths, they followed the nearest road out of the town and fled northwest. And northwest of the town was another lush tropical rainforest. The reason why the goblins were so clear about the enemy's movements was that they could clearly see a bloody path in the town's panoramic view from the top of the airship. Although the surrounding streets and shops were attacked to varying degrees by the enemy, it was still clear from the degree of destruction and cleansing that where the main battlefield was and where the innocent were affected. When they saw the goblin airship hovering above the town, the goblins who had been frightened by the massacre came out again and waved their arms at the sky. Just when everyone thought that the danger was over, an earth-shattering explosion suddenly occurred in the smithy that was burning. The mushroom-shaped building on the ground instantly collapsed into pieces. Countless wood chips and broken and twisted metal plates flew in all directions like raindrops. In the sky, a terrifying rain of fire suddenly fell. This was a large amount of gunpowder stored in the blacksmith's cellar being ignited. After the terrifying explosion, the center of Beta Town caved in to form a huge pit. The bottom of the pit was scorched black and turned into a huge sea of fire. At the edge of the pit, as random items tumbled down, some goblins and slaves could be vaguely seen clinging to the walls of the pit, screaming for help. Corps Commander Barzik's face turned ashen. He gritted his teeth as he looked at the terrible state below him, his fists clenched tightly. Obam, go down and help the mayor immediately. I'm going to take people to track that damned intruder. Quick, carry out the order. Yes. Obam saluted and took the umbrella from the officer next to him. He went to the edge of the airship, clenched his teeth and jumped down. In order to track the enemy as soon as possible, the airship didn't have time to lower itself to a safe altitude to drop him off. Therefore, even if he knew that the safety of the goblin umbrella wasn't high, Obam could only obey the orders of the Corps Commander. When a cluster of small mushrooms bloomed in the sky, the airship turned nimbly and flew towards the northwest of the town. All of you, stay alert. Corps Commander Barzik tore off the suffocating wind buckle, waving the bronze handgun in his hand as he roared. All observers, get into position. We must find that damned fellow. All cannoneers, get ready. Once you find the enemy, I want you to drown him in flames of fury. As it roared, the gnomes with monoculars around their necks ran to both sides of the ship's railings and filled every observation spot. Then, they lifted the monoculars and scanned every suspicious spot below them. Countless goblins were running and shouting within the cabin. Magic cannons forged from bronze were pushed into firing positions. The metal panels on the hull of the airship were pushed open, revealing the pitch-black muzzles of the cannons. However, what was different from Earth was that there weren't mountains of metal bullets and huge barrels in the airship. Instead, they were replaced by boxes of magic batteries. These magic cannons had been perfectly modified by the Great Goblin Empire's Engineering Institute, able to convert the strange energy in the magic batteries into unstable energy fireballs. Once this energy fireball was fired, the slightest collision would cause a terrifying energy explosion. A magic battery that was expensive to manufacture could only fire 5 energy fireballs before it had to be replaced. Therefore, the cannoneers that the Great Goblin Empire nurtured were actually very particular about how to quickly replace the batteries in battle. If a magic battery was replaced before it was completely used up, it would be a huge waste. And if the magic batteries were replaced before the magic cannons had cooled down, it could easily cause an explosion. That was why goblin cannoneers were a profession that required a lot of skill and luck. The goblin airship flew past at a low altitude of 30 meters. Pairs of widened eyes scanned the ground nervously, not letting go of the slightest movement. Finally, at the edge of a woodland 2 miles away from Beta Town, the goblins discovered traces of insects crawling on the soil. Looking at the number of traces, there were clearly no less than 10 insects. Seeing the traces disappear into the dense forest, Corps Commander Barzik was immediately enraged. "Hurry up and tell Neru to hurry over with the Marines. I want him to raze this place to the ground immediately." Neru was the vice-commander of the 7th Marine Regiment. When Barzik rushed back with the goblin airship, he deliberately left the vice-commander in charge of commanding the army. Thus, under Barzik's strict orders, the 7th Marine Regiment that was rushing to Beta Town immediately changed direction, advancing at high speed towards where the commander was. With the goblin tanks and chocobos as their means of transport, the goblins could advance at a speed of 50 kilometers per hour. However, the slightly clumsy magic-powered armors and logging robots clearly couldn't keep up with the speed of the main force. Thus, the entire army stretched out for 3 to 4 kilometers, like a long snake without joint. The insect Lich Bliss, who had been hiding nearby and watching, couldn't help but lick his lips regretfully. His insectoid army had yet to take shape, and while it was effective in small-scale battles, it was like trying to put out a cart of firewood with a cup of water against a burning cart of firewood when facing a large-scale army. The diversion attack on the goblin town had allowed him to capture a few high-ranking goblins, as well as a large number of magic batteries and other unknown materials. The goblin captives had been moved to a secret crypt, while the spoils of war were stored in his storage ring. That was why he could still maintain such high mobility and agility. As for the traces left at the edge of the woodland, it was just a disguise. Bliss sent out 3 scorpions to lure the enemy's leader elsewhere, while he led the remaining 12 scorpions back towards the sawmill camp. He wouldn't fight the enemy head-on. His master's mission was to survive before reinforcements arrived, and then do his best to expand his insectoid army. In the sorcerer world, an insect lich like him was bound by the rules of the sorcerer world, and could never capture intelligent creatures without restraint to expand his army. Here, however, the entire plain was like a piece of delicious cheese that had yet to be developed. No matter what he did here, the despicable sorcerer enforcers wouldn't interfere. That was why he liked this place. Although there were unknown dangers and dangers here, Bliss felt an indescribable sense of comfort and ease from the depths of his heart. He liked this place, or rather, he belonged here. An entire plain filled with delicious flesh and blood was waiting for him to pluck and devour. What could be more beautiful and satisfying than this in this world? Thus, an hour later, Commander Barzik, who was frantically demolishing the place, received another warning from afar. The sawmill camp was under attack. When he hurriedly brought the 7th Marine Regiment back to the sawmill camp, all he saw was a scene of devastation and large pools of blood. What was more frightening was that all the goblin guards and troll slaves who stayed behind were gone. There wasn't even a single corpse in the huge camp. The magic batteries stored in the camp's warehouse were also gone. This was the worst news for the 7th Marine Regiment. All of the magical machinery that the regiment was equipped with had to be powered by magic batteries. Now that the reserves had been wiped out by the enemy, what would the regiment rely on to sustain the upcoming battle? Barzik, who realized this problem for the first time, immediately calmed down. After careful consideration, he didn't send anyone to defend the camp that had nothing to rely on. Instead, he led all the goblin warriors to Beta Town and built a new defense system with it as the center. After doing all this, Corps Commander Bazik finally let go of his so-called pride and sent people to the Imperial Military Headquarters to explain the situation here. He also sent an urgent request for help to the other corps commanders nearby. Chapter 500. 5 days was neither a long time nor a short time. To the Bug Lich Bliss, it was merely a game with a bunch of bug soldiers to accompany the goblins. But to the pitiful goblins of Beta Town, it meant thousands of casualties. Among them were 125 goblins and 900 slaves of various races. On the 5th day, Bliss broke away from the goblins the moment he sensed that the metal ball was brimming with energy, and snuck into the depths of the forest under the cover of the night. When the metal ball unfolded silently in an empty space in the forest, the starlight in the sky dimmed. Rays of terrifying starlight that were comparable to the scorching sun shot out from the core of the ball, illuminating the entire empty space in the forest. The intense radiance even penetrated the dense layers of leaves above their heads, and shot countless light pillars into the pitch-black night sky, illuminating half of the sky as if it was daytime. This strange scene could be clearly seen even from dozens of miles away. Along with the intense radiance came a series of terrifying void ripples that shook the dimensional barriers. As the void ripples became more intense, the spatial fluctuations became more frequent, and the entire dense forest was affected by the wormhole that was about to form. In Beta Town, which was 30 to 40 miles away, the two army commanders, Barzik and Neru, hurriedly ascended the observation platform, and looked at the terrifying light pillars that shot straight into the sky in shock. They did not have elemental talents, and naturally could not sense the existence of the spatial fluctuations in the void. But the inexplicable sense of danger made their hearts beat faster and faster. If they did not press on their hearts with both hands, their hearts that were beating faster and faster might break free from the restraints of their flesh and jump out of their chests. This feeling seems familiar to me. That's. Deputy Army Commander Neru was a skinnier green goblin. He wore a well-ironed military uniform and a pair of elegant gold-rimmed glasses, making him look like a noble goblin. But at this moment, he was so scared that his face was ashen. He pointed at the light pillars in the distance and stammered, unable to speak. That's a long-distance teleportation, and it's a kind of cross-plane teleportation. Barzik's face turned pale. He stared into the distance with his bean-like eyes and uttered the word that Neru was most afraid of while gnashing his teeth. In less than 5 days, 2 such appalling anomalies had appeared around Beta Town in a row. If they still hadn't realized it, they wouldn't be worthy of being the Legion commander of tens of thousands of goblins. Beta Town, no, this plane that they relied on for survival, had already been targeted by a terrifying enemy. The last time the anomaly occurred, it was relatively small, which meant that only a small number of monsters from other planes had invaded. But this time, with such a grand scene, it was likely that the invading enemy would be far more powerful than before. The entire Kariak area was under the control of the 7th Bazik Marine Regiment. Based on past battle procedures, when there was an enemy that the local garrisons couldn't handle, only Bartz had the authority to gather the goblin garrisons in the various cities and send them to the battlefield in a planned manner. In order to clear out the slave rebellions, the 7th Marine Regiment retained the 400 Goblin Mobile Regiment. They were enough to put out those sporadic small rebellions. But at this moment, Barzik looked at the sky in the distance, and his heart sank as if it had sunk into a bottomless cold pool, cold and dark. Most importantly, he could feel that he was still sinking, but he couldn't find any opportunity to get out of the current situation. Where's the goblin airship? Where's our goblin airship? Get them to move out quickly. I want to get there as soon as possible and give the enemy a head-on blow. Barzik was like a gambler who had lost a lot, and he shouted anxiously on the observation platform. Immediately, a goblin officer ran down to pass on the order. Half a quarter of an hour later, the huge goblin airship rose from the parking place northeast of the town. It whistled and quickly flew across the night sky towards the direction where the light rose. For the goblin airship, a distance of 30 to 40 miles was only a matter of half a quarter of an hour. In the anxious anticipation of the thousands of goblins in the town, the goblin airship quickly approached the forest where the accident happened. But just as it descended, intending to spy on the situation in the forest, a fiery meteor shot out and hit its large floating bag. In the next moment, a gigantic fireball appeared in the sky above the forest, and the terrifying shock wave from the explosion blew up all the trees and plants within half a mile of it. Even though they were 30 to 40 miles away, the goblins who had climbed onto roofs, city walls, and observation platforms could feel the scorching heat wave pressing towards them. Under their dumbfounded gazes, the goblin airship that had always been seen as a flying tank exploded into a ball of fire, and then turned into thousands of meteors that scattered down. At this moment, all the goblins were speechless. Even Barzik, who had been shouting crazily on the observation platform, suddenly became despondent, and his head that had always been held high drooped. A powerful enemy had finally arrived. Grim retracted his raised right hand. It was him who, after passing through the wormhole, had cast a spell to shoot down the goblin airship that dared to show off in front of him before he could adjust his mental state. But the price he had to pay for this was huge. A violent fireball with a power of 220 degrees had reduced his mental state by more than a third, and it had also triggered the plane's suppression that entangled his body and soul. He could not help but hold on to his staff and cough violently. Mary, who had transmigrated with him, was obviously unable to adapt to the plane's laws here. Her entire body seemed dispirited, and she could not completely control her own body. The wormhole created by the metal ball was obviously unable to support more people passing through. Once the void energy was exhausted, the wormhole that had lost its support would quickly collapse. As the wormhole became smaller and smaller, the side of the forest facing the wormhole immediately encountered a reverse spatial tide. Countless soil, dried branches, grass, rotten leaves, small insects, and other miscellaneous objects, due to the lack of protection from spells, were all swept up by the restrained spatial tide into the thumb-sized spatial singularity. Finally, with a soft pop, even the spatial singularity disappeared under the powerful plane's healing force. The entire forest regained its former peace. However, standing in the clearing and looking around, it was as if this place had been attacked by a super-terrifying meteor. All the trees within a half-kilometer radius had collapsed. The side of the forest facing the wormhole had been cleaned up, not a single debris or residue could be found. Even the loose soil on the surface of the ground had been sucked away by the spatial singularity, revealing the dark black soil underneath. As a bloodline sorcerer, Mary's physique should have been far superior to Grimm's. However, as Grimm advanced to a Tier 2 sorcerer, his physique surpassed Mary's, becoming stronger and more resilient than her. Thinking back to the first time he transmigrated to another plane, even with the protection of a Tier 6 Great Sorcerer, Grimm was still suppressed by the plane's power to the point where he could hardly breathe. He could barely even walk. This time, however, without the protection of a Great Sorcerer, Grimm protected Mary and successfully withstood the spatial force during the transmigration, entering the goblin plane without suffering any injuries. After transmigrating, Grimm only needed to adjust his breathing a few times to be able to move freely. Although he still could not cast spells as he wished, it was much better than Mary's limp limbs. "I hate this world." Mary leaned on Grimm's body and cursed hatefully. "The damned laws of this plane make me feel like a fish thrown into the desert. I can't breathe anymore." Grimm smiled bitterly as he felt the same. Strictly speaking, sorcerers could be considered a group of high-energy creatures with human bodies. Their bodies were constantly resonating with their surroundings, communicating with each other. The magical energy that permeated the plane constantly nourished their bodies, allowing them to constantly be in a state of high mana. However, in this low magic goblin plane, the concentration of magical energy in the plane of existence was so low that it could cause one to collapse. Moreover, the magical energy here was inert, far from being as active and fresh as in their source world. Hence, even if it was just a normal breath, the Magi would feel as if they had to use all their strength just to get air into their lungs. After a dozen or so breaths, Mary finally got used to the dirty and inferior air in the goblin plane. Only then did she leave Grimm's support and could move on her own. "Bliss, you've done well." Grimm stooped down to retrieve the metal ball that had exhausted all the energy in the void. He looked at Bliss, who was bowing at the side. "Now, bring us to your hiding place. I need more first-hand information on the goblin plane." "My lord, everything is ready." Bliss' black robe shrouded his insect head, revealing a sinister smile. "Please follow me." With that, Bliss turned and led the way into the forest. Grimm and Mary put on their black robes and pulled up their hoods, following him silently. In order to avoid being surrounded by the natives, they had no choice but to keep a low profile and be careful. The last time they transmigrated to the night plane, there was a level 6 great wizard there to support them, so the spatial disturbances did not spread too far. But this time, they practically crossed over in a brisk manner. Due to the lack of the wizard's pagoda's concealment, the intense spatial disturbances could travel thousands of miles. Chapter 501. Bliss's hideout was located underground. This was a series of caves hidden 10 meters underground. There were prisons for prisoners, as well as warehouses for storing spoils of war, but most of them were temporary insect breeding rooms. Because the ventilation was too hidden, the air circulation in the cave was not very good. Moreover, breeding insects required a large amount of fresh blood, so the moment Grimm entered, he could smell the foul and fishy stench in the cave. Bliss was an insect wizard, and had transformed into an immortal insect, so he did not need air, water, and food as much as he did when he was a human. That was why Bliss was indifferent to the poor living environment. It didn't matter to him if he didn't feel anything, but the goblin captive imprisoned in the prison couldn't feel anything. In such a humid and suffocating environment, all the weaker goblins would die in the shortest time possible, leaving only the stronger ones. Unfortunately, the death of the goblin captives did not concern Bliss at all. The dead goblins would be thrown into the insect nest as food for the larvae to evolve, and not a single bit was wasted. If the food supply was too low, he would go to the goblin settlement and plunder more. There was plenty there anyway. That was why he never worried about the decrease in food supply, nor did he consider improving the living environment of the captives so that they could live longer. Of course, the different ranks of the captives enjoyed different levels of treatment. The few that were somewhat famous among the goblins were picked out and locked up in the elegant room. To prevent them from dying prematurely, Bliss even picked a few female goblins to serve them. This included a high-level goblin engineer, 2 mechanics, and 2 low-ranking officers of the 7th Marine Corps that he had captured from Beta Town. Under Bliss's torture, the goblins gradually revealed some information. However, their knowledge was limited, and the information they provided was fragmented, making it difficult to pry into the true secrets of the Goblin Empire. That was why Bliss did not get rid of them, and waited for his master to arrive to decide their fate. Grimm expressed great admiration for Bliss's strictness, and the moment he arrived at the secret cave, he interrogated the goblins one by one. It was obvious that these goblins had suffered the most terrifying fright of their lives in the days they were locked up in the secret cave. Every day, they could see and hear slaves of various races being taken out of the prison and thrown into the horrifying insect nests that filled the Hill of Death. The screams of the slaves before they died, and the sounds of the larvae chewing on the flesh and bones never stopped, lingering in their ears every moment. Although they couldn't see the images of the larvae eating, they could hear and smell it, which was even more enticing to them. Every day, they would watch their companions being dragged away without turning back. Every day, they would listen to the terrifying buzzing sound. Every day, they would smell the foul air filled with the stench of blood and rotting corpses. No goblin could endure such an environment. Many of them did not die of starvation or suffocation, but were scared to death by the terrifying atmosphere of this place. So when Grimm interrogated these goblin nobles, he found that they were speaking incoherently and looked crazy. Even though Grimm had mastered the common language of the goblins in this plane, he almost couldn't understand what they were saying. However, Grimm was different from Bliss. He did not care about the so-called high-level secret. He did not ask about the origin of the magical batteries, nor did he ask about the internal secrets of the Fell Reaver. Instead, he repeatedly asked about the daily lives of the goblins, the governance structure of the Goblin Empire, and the basic operation of the country and army. Although these things were trivial and fragmented, they were of great help to Grimm in piecing together the operating system of the Goblin Plane. Under the guidance of the AI chip, Grimm's questions were all about the core nodes of the Gnome Plane's operations. All of this was common knowledge and humanistic ideology that everyone knew about. Almost no goblin would treat it as a high-level secret that would affect the survival of the Goblin Plane. That was why when all the information was converted into data and flowed into his brain, the basic outline of the mysterious Goblin Empire that was shrouded in mist and clouds slowly appeared. However, it was a pity that there weren't many goblins here, so most of the Goblin Empire's silhouette was shrouded in mystery. They could only slowly deduce the core information from some vague information. Grimm had also appraised the so-called magical batteries. They indeed belonged to a system of energy utilization that was completely different from the sorcerer world. However, Grimm found something familiar in it: basic runes. In the Night Plane, the natives could invent a type of rune that combined the energy of magic crystals with their own life force, creating a unique system of advancement for demon hunters. Of course, the dragon race also added fuel to the fire. And in the Gnome Plane, the weak gnomes actually relied on the accumulation of knowledge and technology to invent the relatively primitive gnome gun. This allowed them to break away from their status as a weak race and become one of the top 10 intelligent races in this plane. What made the goblins stand out and suppress the other races to become the ruler of the plane was the birth of magic machinery. The early magic machinery were simple and crude half-metal puppets that were powered by magic crystals, which were rare in the plane. By burning magic crystals to release the energy within, the magic crystals would be used to power the steam device, which would then move the mechanical gears. Of course, there were many problems with this method, so the early magic machinery were slow and clumsy. Their technology was so simple and crude that it was hard to look at them directly. However, with such primitive magic machinery and a shocking number of guns, the goblins established their position as the sun of the plane. Although the Goblin Plane had low magic power, there were still some natural magic crystals in certain environments. That was why the goblins used their powerful magic army to defeat one powerful race after another. Then, they forcibly enslaved the goblins to mine for them, excavate metal ores, and excavate the rare magic stones. As for the magical batteries, they only appeared in the last 100 years. Some engineers in the Goblin Empire seem to have received guidance from a mysterious figure from the outside world and applied some of their mystical knowledge to magic machinery. So, the Goblin Empire built a huge spatial furnace near the capital, which could continuously absorb magic energy from the void of the plane and seal it in some special crystal prism. This was the origin of the magic batteries in Grimm's hands. Although the energy in these magic batteries was violent and much more dangerous than magic crystals, there was no limit to the number of magic batteries. So, with the magic batteries, the Goblin Empire got rid of its dependence on magic crystals, and the goblins had an inexhaustible source of energy. With the appearance of the magic batteries, the Goblin Empire began to produce more and more new weapons and equipment, and the overall strength of the Goblin Empire rose at an unprecedented speed. However, the 7th Marine Regiment that Grimm was in contact with was still a local garrison, so they did not have the latest magic equipment. In fact, the more he heard from the goblins, the more Grimm had a bad premonition. This was especially so when the high-level goblin engineer named Beirut drew the blueprint of the magic armor on a piece of paper, and Grimm's bad premonition reached its peak. In the process of storing, absorbing, and using magic energy in the Goblin Empire, Grimm had seen too many things that were similar to witchcraft runes. He couldn't help but let his imagination run wild. If there was no communication channel between two completely different worlds, it was impossible to have the same magic runes. For example, the runes that Grimm obtained from the Night Plane were similar to the flame runes of the Sorcerer world. However, the runes were written in a completely different way. The runes of every world existed in a form that was compatible with the laws of the plane. Therefore, the runes produced by the laws of different planes were also different. However, in the blueprint that Beirut drew, Grimm saw too many runes from the Sorcerer world. Although they had been distorted by someone, many of the iconic runes were still there, and they were very clear. Especially when Grimm heard Beirut talking about the Goblin Empire's father of magic, Prince Gazluvi, in a tone of extreme admiration, his face could not help but twitch. Gazluvi, 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 who could be more familiar with this name than Grimm? The reason he was able to bring Bliss and Mary into this place was all thanks to the efforts of Grand Duke Gazlurvi. No, he was no longer a Grand Duke. Instead, he was the highest and greatest goblin engineer, alchemist, and inventor in the Goblin Empire. At the same time, he was also the only prince in the Goblin Empire who did not have a royal bloodline. According to the legends, this goblin prince relied on his intelligence and suddenly invented these magical runes that could change the fate of the Goblin Empire. If it was not for the goblin tradition that only those with the royal bloodline could ascend to the throne, Gazluvi might have become the great king of the goblins. Damn! 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 Grimm ordered Bliss to bring the goblins back into the cave while he paced back and forth in the small cave. At this moment, he vaguely understood why the Sorcerer Association listed exchanging knowledge with other planes as the #1 taboo after advancing to become a wizard. In the past, he was young and ignorant. He only knew that basic runes were common knowledge in the Sorcerer world, and it was not considered a top secret. That was why he made a fair trade with Gazluvi through Cabby. At that time, this kind of exchange seemed to be a great bargain for their side. But now, it seemed that it was really stupid beyond compare. More importantly, he had actually created a huge problem for himself 70 years later. Chapter 502. The outcome of the interrogation was so absurd that Grimm didn't know whether to laugh or cry. At this moment, he finally understood the true meaning of the phrase, "Runes are the source of wizard power." The foundation of knowledge that could push wizards to the pinnacle of power had unparalleled value and significance to other planes. For example, the Goblin Plane had gone through hundreds and thousands of years of nurturing and accumulation of primitive power such as atomic weapons, steam power, and other things. Only then did it form a unique system of civilization, a mechanical civilization. They had dug out the limits of their mechanical power and were in an awkward situation where they had nowhere else to go. Although they managed to dig out the energy of magic stones later on, allowing the Goblin Empire to embark on the path of developing magic machinery, the Goblin Plane lacked magic stones. However, the goblins lacked magic stones in the plane of existence, which tied their hands and feet, making it difficult for them to experience explosive growth and leap forward. However, the beginner runes of the Sorcerer world that Gazlurvi accidentally obtained had obviously changed the fate of the Goblin Plane. Gaz-Lurvy was indeed a great inventor. Just by modifying witchcraft runes, he actually created goblin runes that were suitable for magic machinery in the low-magic goblin plane. The combination of goblin runes and magic machinery made the Goblin Empire even more powerful. From a certain point of view, this tiger was raised by Grim one bite at a time. This was what Grim was most vexed about. However, the most vexed person in the underground cave was not Grim, but the insect Lich Bliss, who had just welcomed a new batch of warbugs. The black swarm of warbugs filled half of the cave. This scene should have made Bliss ecstatic. However, his face was ashen and he was furious. It was for no other reason than the newly hatched warbugs. He had captured so many captives in one go and used their blood to irrigate the bug nest, but all that crawled out of the nest were spike scorpion larvae. The reason was that the energy contained in the flesh and blood of these prey was too thin. It was so thin that it was not enough for the spike scorpion larvae to evolve into adult ones. Bliss had no choice but to accept the cruel reality in front of him. In the upcoming planar war, he would still only have 15 spike scorpion warriors to use. The rest would only be cannon fodder. It was unwise for them to face a native army that had gathered the elites of the plane with their current strength. However, just as Grim and the other two were quietly resting and waiting for the plane suppression to gradually ease, a mysterious force beyond their imagination was slowly approaching the lumberyard camp. The new enemy came from the sky. A terrifyingly huge airship that was more than 10 times larger than the goblin airship slowly stopped in the sky. The huge body of the airship cast a huge shadow on the ground. Then, a dozen black dots that were visible to the naked eye jumped off the airship and rapidly expanded in their field of vision. At a low altitude of less than 20 meters from the ground, more than 10 black dots suddenly spewed out orange flames, and then their falling speed abruptly slowed down. Finally, with a series of dull thuds, 13 peculiar magical machines that were 4 meters tall but a few times smaller than the Fel Reaver descended from the sky and landed steadily on the empty ground. Even with the recoil of the flames, these magic machines still left large craters that were half a meter deep on the ground. Then, amidst a series of metallic screeches, beast-shaped magical machines of various shapes and sizes appeared in the field. Wolf, bear, octopus, ape, pterosaur, giant, the 13 strange magic machines had 13 different shapes. Not only did they cover the sea, land, and air, even some of the rarer species could be seen. Most of these magic machines were 3 to 5 meters tall, and were not as heavy and clumsy as the Fel Reaver. When they gathered in front of a 3-meter-tall metal goblin with strange footsteps, their movements gave off a lithe and nimble feeling. Asterisk crack crack. Asterisk with a strange crisp sound, the black wolf-like magic machine suddenly opened its mouth, and a small console slid out from within. Sitting on it was a goblin wearing a strange uniform. "Boss, it's here." According to the report from the local garrison, the area where the invaders are active is here. "Yes, boss, should we split up or gather together?" This time, it was a female goblin that spoke. She came out from a bear-shaped magic machine. In terms of weight, this bear-shaped magic machine was undoubtedly the heaviest and had the highest defense among all the magic machines. In fact, from a goblin's aesthetic point of view, this female goblin's face was huge, her skin was green and smooth, and her body was petite and graceful. She was a rare goblin beauty in the Goblin Empire. Unfortunately, in the eyes of other races, the female goblin was as ugly as the male goblins with the same short stature, green skin, and green fur all over her body. With these two guys taking the lead, the rest of the magic machines immediately opened their cabins, revealing the goblin warriors hiding inside. They gathered together and chattered among themselves. "Shut up, all of you." The metal goblin's chest opened up, revealing a short and strong goblin warrior. Compared to the other goblin warriors, this guy, whom they called leader, had a powerful aura around him. He seemed to be a special profession that had advanced. If one were to use the Sorcerer World's power system to measure it, among the 13 magic armor machinists present, only this guy had the power of a sorcerer. The rest were mostly quasi-wizards, and 1 or 2 of them had the power of high-level apprentices. This was actually one of the notable characteristics of the Goblin Plane. The goblins here were not very strong, and most of the time they were very weak. After all, the goblin race mainly consisted of engineers, mechanics, and alchemists. It was already unimaginable for them to be able to increase their physical attributes to the level of a sorcerer in such a low magic world. Therefore, the strength of the goblins was mostly due to the power of the magic machines. They were basically weak themselves. It could also be said that if it weren't for the sake of better controlling the magical equipment and withstanding the shock waves and pressure from the powerful magical equipment in battle, these elite goblin warriors wouldn't have been so determined to train their bodies crazily. After all, when the magic machines moved at high speeds, ordinary goblins would not be able to withstand the super overload and would die directly. The leader of the metal goblins said coldly, "Don't be too arrogant. This time, the invading creatures from another world are famous evil sorcerers in the multiverse. Since Lord Gazlerv sent us here, it's for us to successfully capture those evil sorcerers, not for you guys to come here for a holiday. So, all of you, keep your spirits up. If we capture those sorcerers, I'll invite you guys to Vini Beach for a month." "Wow, boss, you're so great, long live Tigul, boss, we'll all listen to you." Hearing the promise of the goblin mechanic leader Tigul, the Magic Machine Legion immediately burst into loud cheers. The goblin mechanics danced excitedly as if victory was within their grasp. After a series of clanking sounds, all the goblin mechanics retreated into their magic machines and controlled them to carefully search the lumberyard camp. After being ravaged several times, the lumberyard's campsite had long since become unrecognizable. It was a scene of devastation. The logs that were originally piled up in piles were now scattered everywhere. The original dozen or so wooden houses and workshops in the camp had also collapsed and could no longer be used. However, what puzzled the goblins was that although most of the buildings and items in the camp had been severely damaged, they did not disappear. Only the goblins and foreign slaves stationed in the camp were missing, as if they had been taken away by the enemy as spoils of war. Of course, the magic batteries that were stored in every camp had also gone missing. The octopus-like magic machine in the Magic Machine Legion clearly had a talent in tracking. The dozen or so metal tentacles under its huge metal head stepped on the ground and followed the vague traces left by the enemy into the forest. The rest of the magic machines immediately followed behind the octopus-like magic machine and searched the depths of the forest in a fan shape. In the sky. The moment the Magic Machine Legion went deep into the forest, in a secret room inside the giant floating ship, an old goblin wearing a luxurious noble robe was crouching in front of a concave lens, squinting his eyes as he carefully monitored everything that was happening on the ground. As he gently rotated the rotors, the rotating mirror constantly adjusted its angle, always aiming at the Magic Machine Legion. Under his command, the giant floating ship slowly advanced into the depths of the forest under the drive of a mysterious force. "Prince Gazlervi, do you think, should we put the rest of the mecha squads down as well?" On the metal control panel in front of the old goblin, Captain Tort's voice suddenly came from a loudspeaker. "There's no need." The old goblin sneered and said coldly, "The first batch of wizards sent by the enemy can't be too strong. We must lure them out of their hiding place as soon as possible. If we send too many magic machines, they will be scared away. This time, no matter what, we must capture them alive. I must obtain the knowledge in their minds." After saying that, he coughed violently and panted. It could be seen that this Gazlervi, who had dealt with Cabby many times, had become very weak, as if he had entered the declining period of the goblin race. "Understood." In the loudspeaker, Tort's voice sounded again, "Don't worry, Prince. We will definitely complete the mission. Everything for the Empire." Towards the end, the gnome captain's tone was filled with fervor and excitement. The Empire? He. After turning off the communication, Gazlurvi could not help but sneer. I'm doing this for the immortality spell in their minds. Those idiots in the Empire only know how to stick to the old traditions, guarding a narrow world to rule. Humph, all of them added up is not as valuable as my life. Cabby, little fool, do you really think I don't know what you've done in secret? I hope that your master is among the wizards who have traveled here this time. This way, you will know that the great Gazlurvi is the smartest goblin in the world. Chapter 503. The arrival of the strange party did not escape the notice of Bliss's eyes. After quickly cleaning up the underground cavern, Grim and the other two returned to the surface and laid in ambush in the forest. From the looks of it, this party of magic weapons that had followed the traces they left behind should be the elite troops of the Goblin Empire. Since the planar war was going to break out sooner or later, it was best to take advantage of the opportunity to find out more about their enemies. Hence, Grim and the other two did not choose to leave. Instead, they laid in ambush and waited for the strange party to arrive. Since the Goblin Empire was able to dominate the entire plane, they definitely had their own strength. The goblins themselves were weak, and Grim and the other two did not take them seriously at all. Hence, the reason why they were so strong was because of these magical weapons that resembled metal puppet. Hence, even if it was just to gather some basic data, this battle was a must. Mary had rested for a night. Although she had not recovered to her peak, her basic combat abilities were no longer affected. Grim was a grade 2 fire wizard. Although he had to endure more pressure from the plane, the speed at which he analyzed the laws of the plane was not slow with the help of the AI chip. Hence, he still had basic combat abilities. Mary flapped her wings and flew to the top of a tree, using the dense canopy to conceal herself. Bliss, on the other hand, laughed coldly and burrowed into the ground, disappearing without a trace. However, with the existence of the soul contract, Grim could sense that Bliss was hiding underground in a large shrub on the right. His scorpion battle beetles had already spread out to every corner of the forest. Grim did not hide, nor did he need to. He stood alone at the entrance of the underground cavern, calmly observing every movement in the distance. Amidst a series of strange metallic noises, a team of 13 battle magical machines slowly entered his sight. Grim's powerful gaze slowly swept across the magic weapons. Blue light flickered in his eyes, and he immediately deduced their external appearance, habits, positions of nodes, and possible methods of attack in the shortest time possible. Of course, it was just a deduction. All the details had to be verified in battle. So, since we are here, let us fight. Grim didn't say a word. He grabbed at the air with his right hand and dense fire element frantically gathered in his palm. A head-sized lava fireball quickly appeared and floated in the air. As the fireball spun, the terrifyingly high temperature and the approaching hot wind made the demonic machine squad that had just entered the battlefield stop in their tracks. At this moment, such a scene unfolded in front of the entire demonic machine squad. A man, a powerful wizard who was more than 2 meters tall, stood in front of them. He held a terrifying fireball in his hand, and the intensity of the flames kept rising. He stared at them coldly. With the help of the recon meter in the battle magic machine, they could clearly see the energy value rising rapidly. 2,300 degrees, 2,500 degrees, 3,000 degrees, 500 degrees. Damn it, how could the enemy be so strong? A fireball, he casually gathered, could reach a temperature of 3,000 to 4,000 degrees? If they were hit head-on by such a fireball, none of the battle magic machines would be able to escape unscathed. The demonic machine squad swallowed their saliva with difficulty. The arrogant demonic machine squad immediately became silent. Some of them even stealthily moved their magic machines to the periphery. Of course, it wasn't because they were afraid of retreating, but because they wanted to widen the battlefield to avoid colliding with each other while dodging the fireball. Evil wizard, I am Tigul of the demonic machine squad. You, the 3-meter-tall metal goblin, was just about to step forward and say something when the fireball in Grimm's hand moved, drawing a beautiful arc in the air as it flew towards him. Damn it! Tigul didn't have the time to say anything else. He raised both of his metal hands, and his palms split open, revealing 2 pitch-black muzzles. In the next moment, a rain of metal bullets rained down on the lava fireball like a violent storm under the impetus of the gunfire. The rest of the battle magic machines also retreated, extending pitch-black muzzles from various parts of their bodies to assist their captain in intercepting the terrifying fireball. Thus, this lava fireball, with a flame intensity as high as 210 degrees and a temperature of almost 4,000 degrees, exploded in the middle of the battlefield. Violent flame shockwaves and a meteor shower filled with lava fragments shot out in all directions. While the battle magic machines were dodging, they ejected light blue energy barriers from their bodies to protect themselves. The energy barrier seemed to only be effective against magical elements, and could not block purely physical attacks. Therefore, the lava shards easily penetrated the combat magic machines and smashed against their metal shells, producing loud bangs. However, the subsequent shock waves of flames were completely blocked, and did not come into contact with the bodies of the battle magic machines. A basic energy barrier. Its resistance against energy attacks seemed to be between 350 to 500 degrees. A blue light flashed in Grimm's eyes. In just a few seconds, he had seen through the essence of the energy barrier and estimated the strength of the barrier. Here, Grimm could not help but feel that Gazruvi was indeed a genius goblin engineer. He actually managed to transplant a low-level spell onto a battle magic machine. Moreover, it displayed a decent elemental defense. One had to know that a basic energy barrier cast by an apprentice would only have an energy defense of around 50 degrees. However, after Gazruvi transplanted it onto a battle magic machine, its strength suddenly increased by 10 times. The reason for this was that the endurance of a human's body was far weaker than that of a battle magic machine. An energy output of up to 50 degrees in an instant was still within the endurance of a wizard apprentice's body. If the defense was increased by 10 times, it might sound like the defense would be better, but the wizard apprentice would be completely crippled. However, this problem did not exist with battle magic machines. As long as the metal body could withstand it, the instantaneous energy output was usually several times or even tens of times greater than that of a human. If they could choose better and more suitable magic metals to build the energy transmission system, it would not be a problem to instantly increase the energy output to 100 times that of a human. Therefore, by relying on the uniqueness of the battle magic machine, they were able to reach the strength of an advanced energy barrier with just a basic energy barrier. Seeing this, Grimm could not help but frown slightly. Even a grade 2 fire wizard like him would need 3 all-out attacks to break through an energy barrier of 500 degrees. If it was an agility-based wizard like Mary, it would probably take 7 to 8 consecutive attacks to break through. Grimm's heart skipped a beat. He immediately sent the data he had calculated to Mary and Bliss. Now that he had tested the battle magic machine's defense, he needed to test its attack power. Grimm strode forward, grabbing and tossing with one hand, and a powerful lava fireball flew out. The fireball's attack power was more than 200 degrees, and it was enough to put a heavy psychological pressure on the magic machine squad. In order to test its accuracy, Grimm did not use a lava barrier. Instead, he used a pure flame barrier. The violent and ferocious elemental flames condensed into a shield-like flame barrier that rotated rapidly around Grimm's body, blocking all the attacks for him. The torrential barrage of metal bullets landed on the flame shield. The incoming metal bullets were all melted by the high temperature of the flames into liquid metal, and then completely vaporized in a small explosion of flames. Grimm continued to move forward. The 3 fire shields that were spinning around him crackled and popped. The shields formed from pure flames were trembling, and dark red cracks had already appeared on the surface of the bright red shield. 15 to 25 degrees. Grimm immediately estimated the basic strength of the battle magic machine's metal bullets and made a basic evaluation of their attack power. The good thing was that the battle magic machine's bullets were purely physical attacks and did not carry any elemental damage. The bad thing was that the battle magic machine's attacks were too fast. Once the attacks of a beginner apprentice were stacked together, they could cause a lot of trouble to a wizard. The 13 battle magic machines surrounded Grimm and kept a distance of 20 to 30 meters from him. The battle magic machines then crazily flooded the battle magic machine's body with their metal bullet. Most of the battle magic machines were destroyed by the strange flame barrier around Grimm's body. Some of the bullets missed and landed on the tall ancient trees around him. Even the trees that needed 3 people to wrap their arms around them could not last more than 2 seconds. Wood chips flew everywhere and the trees were riddled with holes. Then, they suddenly collapsed with a series of cracking sounds. Through special observation lenses, the goblin mechanics hiding in the magic machines watched the human wizard being surrounded and beaten up by the battle magic machines, but he could not fight back at all. No, the battle magic machine could still fight back. It was the kind of powerful lava fireball that could shock the goblins. However, this kind of fireball was not a problem for the elite magic machine squad. They could either use the battle magic machine to blow up the fireball in midair, or dodge quickly to avoid the fireball's landing point. In short, this evil wizard who was surrounded was not as scary as the rumors said. However, just when the members of the magic machine squad felt relieved, Grimm, who thought he had completed the basic test, finally unleashed his full strength. 2 lava shields made of lava and pure flame quickly formed in front of Grimm and replaced the flame barrier that was riddled with holes. With the protection of these 2 lava shields, the battle magic machine that was on the verge of collapsing immediately became as stable as Mount Tai. Grimm raised his right hand, and a large area of effect crimson flame storm engulfed the whole area, including all the battle magic machines. The violent and ferocious elemental flame turned into hundreds and thousands of flame streams that collided with each other randomly, creating a mess in the battlefield. It also quickly blocked the vision of the goblin mechanic. Be careful. High-speed teleportation. Captain Tigule was experienced. He immediately sensed that something was wrong and loudly warned. Chapter 504. Almost at the same time that the goblin mechanic's vision was blocked by the raging flames, Grimm disappeared. When he reappeared, he was already beside the wolf-shaped magic machine. In one breath, 3 lava fireballs exploded beneath the wolf-shaped magic machine. The violent flame shockwaves sent the magic machine flying into the sky. In the terrifying wave of flames, the energy shield around the wolf-shaped magic machine flickered a few times before finally shattering. The moment the energy shield shattered, Grimm raised his head and shot out 2 highly condensed flaming rays from his eyes. The rays merged into one in midair and struck the center of the 2 front limbs of the wolf-shaped magic machine. And that was where the goblin mechanic was hiding. The sudden attack of the evil sorcerer had obviously scared the goblin mechanic out of his wits. His body was in the air, and most of his movements could not be completed. Sensing the terrifying rays that were shot at the metal shield in front of it, it quickly moved its hands across the 7 joysticks and the 15 crystal buttons, desperately controlling the wolf-shaped magic machine to complete all kinds of evasive maneuvers. Unfortunately, it was too late. Although the 4-finger-thick crasso alloy was much sturdier than ordinary metals, it was only average in terms of anti-magic properties. After all, there were very few monsters in the goblin plane that had elemental attack. Therefore, anti-magic properties were not the first consideration that the goblin engineers had when building magic machines. The 2 laser-like flaming rays overlapped with each other. Although they were not as thick as a pinky finger, they had an unimaginable cutting power. They almost instantly corroded through the metal shield. The goblin mechanic hid in the narrow cabin and did not have any space or opportunity to dodge. The flaming rays directly pierced through the body of the goblin mechanic. As the intensity of the flaming sun ray increased, the purplish-red beam of light penetrated the goblin mechanic's body and the metal layer on its back. It shot out from the back of the wolf-type magical beast and shot straight into the sky. The entire 1-meter-thick wolf-shaped magic machine was penetrated by the flaming rays shot out from Grimm's eyes. One could only imagine the fate of the goblin mechanic who was hiding within. "Billy! Billy!" Exclamations and screams rang out one after another in the arena. These gnome mechanics clearly had a good relationship with each other. Seeing that Billy was in trouble, a few combat magic machines roared and charged forward. This was especially true for the bear-shaped magic machine, which was obviously a tank type. As it roared and charged forward, it opened its huge mouth and shot out a 10-meter-long scarlet flame pillar. The octopus waved its 8-meter-long metal tentacles and lashed at Grimm like long whips. Playing with fire in front of a fire wizard? A sneer appeared on Grimm's handsome face. His figure paused for a moment before he disappeared into an elemental flame that soared into the sky. Most of the battle machines in the field only had the strength of an elite wizard. Only their captain, Tigul, could barely display the strength of a rank 2 creature. But even so, this battle was still completely one-sided. If it wasn't for the fact that Grimm was suppressed by the plane and could not display the full strength of a rank 2 fire wizard, the situation of the Magic Machine squad would have been even worse. This time, Flame Leap allowed Grimm to teleport a little further away and appear behind the pterosaur flying in the air. Without any hesitation, Grimm's right hand ignited with a shockingly hot purple flame. He bent down and stabbed it into the back of the pterosaur. The pterosaur's energy shield and the flaming hand only lasted for a few seconds before it exploded. The purple flaming hand immediately stabbed into the metal shell that was as hard as steel. "Winnie, he's on your back. Hurry up and get rid of him!" Tigul roared angrily and raised his arms. The 2 goblin fire arrows attached to his arms immediately burst into flames and flew towards Grimm, who was on top of the pterosaur. The rest of the Magic Machine squad immediately turned around and fired a new wave of metal bullets towards the sky. Their comrades were protected by the metal shell, so they would not die under the barrage of bullets. Therefore, they could attack with all their might and force the damned evil wizard away from Winnie. Grimm let out a muffled groan. He could not care less about killing the little guy under him. He kicked off the ground and disappeared in midair with a flash of flames. "Damn it! Hurry up and dodge!" Just as Tigul's metal gnome rushed under the pterosaur, he saw the evil magus disappear into the flames once more. He could only come to a sudden halt and warn his companions as he quickly searched for the location of the evil magus. With a light sound, Grimm appeared behind the octopus magic machine this time. His eyes swept across the 3 metal tentacles under the octopus magic machine in an instant. The octopus magic machine wanted to turn around and escape, but Grimm stretched out his hand. Countless fire elemental particles in the air instantly condensed into a huge flaming hand that covered the sky and grabbed the octopus magic machine's round metal body. The huge flaming hand closed slightly, and the 5 thick fingers that were wreathed in raging flames immediately squeezed the energy shield until it creaked. Seeing that he was unable to break through the opponent's energy shield, Grimm let out a soft shout. He raised his flaming hand, and the struggling octopus magic weapon immediately turned into a huge bowling ball, smashing ferociously at the metal gnome that was pouncing over. Seeing his subordinates in trouble, Tigul, who had no choice but to save them, could only control the metal gnome to leap high into the air. Its 2 thick metal hands caught the howling octopus magic weapon. Under the huge impact of the octopus magic machine, the 2 men were sent flying for more than 10 meters before they landed on the ground. Tigul stretched his leg forward and kicked back, sinking more than half a meter into the ground before he could dissipate the huge impact. However, with this delay, Tigul was forced to leave the battlefield by the octopus magic machine. Grimm smiled coldly and disappeared into the flames once again. Seeing that Grimm had disappeared, all the battle magic machines on the battlefield shuddered and gathered together. They stood back to back and watched their surroundings vigilantly. Those that stood further away were shocked and immediately started to move at high speed. To be honest, under the unpredictable attacks of the octopus magic machine, even though they had the advantage in numbers, they were still surrounded. Even though their companions were right beside them, they did not feel safe at all. If there was even the slightest movement around them, they would do their best to escape while pouring out their metal barrage. Although they knew that the metal barrage posed almost no threat to the octopus magic machine, it could still slow down the octopus magic machine and buy them a few seconds to escape. Therefore, as long as the ball of flames got close to any combat magic machine, it would immediately be attacked by the terrifying barrage. This time, Grimm did not appear beside any combat magic machine. Instead, he flashed almost 100 meters away from them. When he stepped out of the pillar of flames, his left hand was already holding the destructive flame wizard's staff. A high-pitched and sharp witchcraft incantation echoed in the sky. Damn it, this evil wizard did not even chant an incantation, but the witchcraft he cast was already so terrifying. If he was allowed to finish his incantation, the magic machine squad would suffer even more casualties. Almost instantly, the combat magic machines that were scattered all over the battlefield immediately fanned out and pounced towards the octopus magic machine squad. While running, they continuously attacked the lava shield around the octopus magic machine squad. While they were focusing all their attention on Grimm, Mary and Bliss, who were hiding in the dark, finally made their move. Mary chose the pterosaur magic machine. It was the only one among all the combat magic machines that could fly at an altitude of 20 meters. More importantly, the energy shield around its body did not recover in time. Such a mistake should not happen on a battlefield where life and death were at stake. Just as the pterosaur magic machine was about to dive down and launch a surprise attack on Grimm, a huge figure with bat wings suddenly appeared on its back. There, on the metallic body with smooth lines, was an inverted triangular hole. That was the mark left behind by Grimm's attack, because he did not have enough time to corrode the pterosaur magic machine squad's shell. Mary's tall and graceful body swayed gently as she walked above the hole. She instantly pulled the huge blood-colored bow in her hand to its fullest extent. Incomparably violent blood-colored energy quickly gathered at the tip of Mary's finger, condensing into an exquisite blood-colored arrow. Bang! The bowstring exploded. The blood-colored arrow pierced through the hole and immediately penetrated the last remaining piece of the metal shell. Then, it exploded in the goblin cockpit. The goblin mechanic named Winnie died instantly. All her blood essence was corroded, turning into a thick blood mist that returned to Mary's body. The pterosaur magic machine fell from the sky. The insect lich Beasley had his eyes on a huge metal giant. Due to its large size, its movements were slow, so it inevitably fell behind its companions. However, just as the metal giant was moving forward and firing with all its might, the layer of mud beneath its feet suddenly collapsed, catching it off guard and causing it to fall to the ground with a loud bang. Before the metal giant could get up, an innumerable horde of insects surged out of the broken mud like a tide, instantly devouring its body. The metal giant struggled desperately in the horde of insects, but its body was firmly restrained by a dozen thorny scorpions that swarmed it. Thus, the horde of insects crawled all over the metal giant's body, drilling all over its body, looking for a hole that led to the inside. But you don't say they really found it. The goblin mechanics still needed to breathe even when hiding in the cabins of the magic machines, so every combat magic machine had air vents on the surface that led directly to the cabins. However, under normal circumstances, These air holes were very hidden and extremely small, so ordinary enemies would not be able to attack the goblin mechanic through them. However, the scorpions controlled by the insect Lich Bliss were obviously not ordinary enemies. Chapter 505. To be fair, the basic strength of this demonic mechanical mech legion in front of him was not bad. The basic combat strength of its members could reach the level of a veteran wizard, and their leader, Tygol, even had the strength of a grade 2 wizard. However, while their strengths were outstanding, their weaknesses were even more prominent. The ones piloting the magic machines were all well-trained goblin mechanics. They hid in the cramped cabin, and there were still many blind spots in the areas that could be seen through the lenses. Moreover, they were still too weak. Once the shell of the magic machine was broken, they often could not withstand a casual attack from a wizard. However, the most limiting factor in the combat strength of the magic machines was the lack of enough magic iron alloy. They used the strongest crasso alloy in the goblin plane to create the magic machines. This alloy had reached an outstanding level in terms of toughness. Unfortunately, its magic resistance was too weak. The goblin plane lacked magical creatures, so they would not invest a huge amount of money in researching an excellent magic iron alloy for a few monsters. This caused the magic machine legion's metal shell to be easily pierced by wizards when they were attacked by excessive spells. With so many factors stacked together, it caused the defeat of the magic machine legion. That Tigul was quite powerful, but he lacked the means to imprison magi. The red-armored female sorceress with bat wings on her back seemed delicate and weak, but her movements were so fast that Tygol felt ashamed. If Tygol wanted to kill her, even if he raised his speed to the limit, he could only follow behind her and eat dirt. The evil wizard who was good at repelling insects was even more vigilant and cunning. Every time Tygol tried to get close to him, he would explode into scorpions on the ground and flee in all directions. Although Tygol could burn a bunch of them with his flamethrower, it did not seem to have any effect on the insect wizard. Soon, the fleeing scorpions would regroup in another area and take the form of a wizard. Then, he would continue to command the swarm to destroy one magic machine after another. As for the leader of the evil wizards, the enemy covered in flames was even more difficult to deal with. Flame jump every 3 seconds allowed him to appear anywhere on the battlefield at any time. He seemed to have given up on directly killing the members of the magic machinery squad, and instead frequently used his displacement and powerful flame attacks to easily shatter the dense energy shield of the combat machinery. As for the combat magic machines that had lost the protection of the energy shield, he would throw them to the other 2 wizards with his flaming hands while he focused on breaking the shell outside the walnuts. With their excellent cooperation, the number of members of the 13 demonic mechanical mech clan continued to decrease. As for that Tygol whose eyes were about to pop out of their sockets, there was nothing he could do apart from madly chasing after them. In all seriousness, the metal goblin machinery that Tigul controlled was quite rich in combat method. There were goblin missiles and fire arrows for long-range attacks, explosive muskets for long-range attacks, flamethrowers for mid-range attacks, and iron fists for close combat. With this kind of strength, even if he had to face a rank 2 magical beast, he would still be able to fight. But to use these tricks to deal with a few evil wizards who came from another plane? Sorry, the techniques were too simple, and there were too few methods that could pose a serious threat to the wizards. However, just as the demonic mechanical mech clan was being slaughtered by Grimm and the others, the floating airship that was high up in the sky was also slowly approaching the battlefield. Through the large crystal lenses, countless goblins in the battle hall of the airship were angrily watching the live broadcast of the evil wizards slaughtering their comrades. Seeing their comrades combat magic machinery being taken down one by the wizards using various methods, and then easily penetrating the metal deck and killing the goblin mechanics inside, the atmosphere in the battlefield instantly exploded. Hundreds of goblins angrily yelled, and kept asking the commander to join the battle. They were all elite goblin mechanics trained by the Goblin Empire. Wait, 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 what are we waiting for? A goblin mechanic with dyed yellow hair jumped on the table and roared angrily. Our comrades are being slaughtered down there, and we have hundreds of combat magic machinery here. Although we can't beat them one-on-one, we can still kill them if we swarm them. So what are we waiting for? Yeah. Why haven't you ordered us to join the battle? We want to join the battle. Shrill roars sounded one after another in the battle hall, and the emotions that had just been suppressed were ignited again. Because this is the order of Prince Gazruvi. Tort, the commander of the huge airship, said coldly as he straightened his military uniform. Like a sudden gust of cold wind blowing through everyone's heart, the noisy battle hall once again fell into dead silence. All the goblin mechanics quietly sat down, no longer daring to make any noise. In the Goblin Empire, the name Gazruvi was a totem and a symbol, representing the future of all the goblins and the hope of the Goblin Empire's rise. Although they still did not understand the order from above, after hearing this name that had a special meaning, they could only obediently sit down and wait for the order with faces full of humiliation. In the secret room in the heart of the huge airship, old Prince Gazruvi was watching the battle on the ground with a fanatical expression. Gazing at the endless fire spells, the powerful half-human, half-bat sorceress, and the unpredictable insect-repellent sorcerer, Gazruvi didn't feel the slightest bit of reluctance even though it was his own magic machine legion that was being trampled by them. Instead, he displayed sufficient excitement and madness. Ever since he became a prince, he took off his ugly white trench coat, but he did not remove the goblin multifunction detection glasses on his right eye. At this moment, he was watching the sorcerer's battle with great interest while using different instruments to measure the level of the sorcerer's attack energy. When the amazing numbers were projected on the monocle, the old goblin could not help but exclaim, especially when the monocle locked on to the fire sorcerer. This was especially so when its monocle locked onto the fire wizard. The power of the spells that the fire wizard cast with every move he made was off the chart. Every number that appeared on the monocle was blood red. Tort, prepare the giant goblin cannon. I want to see how strong these sorcerers are. The old goblin grabbed a golden megaphone and screamed loudly. Yes, Prince. As the order was given, the metal deck at the front of the floating airship split to the left and right, and a black muzzle with a diameter of 1 meter appeared. Then, as the airship shook violently, a huge amount of magic energy was transferred from the engine room to the giant goblin cannon, and the muzzle gradually lit up with a terrifying, blinding black light. In the secret room, the old goblin controlled the giant cannon and aimed the crosshair at the fire sorcerer standing tall. Through the giant monocle, the old goblin could clearly see the fire sorcerer raise his head, and his eyes burning with crimson flames collided with the old goblin's gaze from thousands of meters away. Have a taste of my giant goblin cannon, invader! The old goblin let out a high-pitched scream and fiercely slammed the crystal button on the table. A muffled hum was heard. The airship trembled as a blinding beam of black light shot toward Grim like a bolt of lightning. Grim had long since noticed the abnormality in the sky. The abnormally powerful magic energy was like a rising black sun, and it was difficult to ignore its existence. Grim used a ring of resistance to repel all the enemies around him. He then stood up straight and looked up to silently sense the enemy's intentions. This was a mass of magic energy that had not been modified, and it still contained the violent and chaotic nature of the void. It should be the void energy extracted directly from the spatial furnace. From this point of analysis, there must be a stable spatial furnace in the core area of the floating airship. Goblins did not have innate elemental talents, so it was difficult for them to convert the void energy into various forms of magical spells. Therefore, they could only gather the void energy and use the extremely crude method of shooting it directly to use this energy. However, the void energy had the characteristics of annihilation and chaos, and it was also a huge damage to the stable elemental energy in a sorcerer's body. Therefore, although the goblin's attack method was simple and crude, it was not weak at all. Grim watched as the enemy's cannons lit up like a black sun, watched as the body of the airship trembled violently, and watched as a black light beam shot straight towards his chest. The speed of the black light was not fast, but the void energy it contained could obviously destroy the elemental balance in the plane. Therefore, wherever the black light went, the void of the plane trembled and surged, and the air crackled with a chain reaction of elemental energy. The black light beam, that was originally less than a meter in diameter, had already expanded to a huge light beam with a radius of 20 meters. By the time it reached Grim, the light beam had covered a radius of 100 meters, and the attack power per unit area was over 1,000 degrees. It was not the temperature, but the energy attack power was over 1,000 degrees. Grim's heart trembled, and he used a flame leap to teleport as far as he could. Mary, who was at the edge of the black light beam, spread her wings and escaped at a terrifying speed that the naked eye could not follow. This made things difficult for Bliss, who did not have any mobility spells. He lowered his body and turned into a swarm of insects that burrowed into the ground. The dozen or so thorny scorpion battle beetles surged forward in a frenzy, forming a layered black beetle shield above his head. However, the void energy attack of over 1,000 degrees was not that easy to deal with. Chapter 506. Ever since the start of the battle, Grim had been doubtful. He felt that the goblin plane did not live up to its name, and the power it displayed was too weak. Although they were both small planes, the goblin plane's power system was much weaker than the night plane's. At the very least, the night plane still had grade 4 dragon knights, but in the goblin plane, a grade 2 battle magic machine like Tigul was already considered top-notch. Grim had always been puzzled by this situation, and he had planned to observe for a while longer to find the source. However, at this moment, when he saw the black beam shooting towards him, Grim instantly understood where the goblin plane's core power was. Damn it! They've invested most of the plane's power into magic energy. Grim had the ability to quickly leave the battlefield, so he could easily imagine all this. However, Bliss, the bug shaman who was left in the range of the black beam, instantly became the most pitiful person on the battlefield. Like Bliss, there were 2 other battle magic machines within the range of the black beam. The moment they came into contact with the black beam, they quickly melted like candles and then vaporized. Bliss was still digging into the ground, but it was a pity that his digging speed was not as fast as the black beam. Under the illumination of the black beam, the scorched ground from the battle quickly melted away layer by layer. In the blink of an eye, Bliss, who had drilled nearly 5 meters underground, reappeared. 15 thorny scorpions formed a black shield, stacked on top of Blitz's head, barely shielding him from the black light. However, the terrifying elemental chain reaction still affected him. The void energy destroyed the delicate elemental balance in Bliss' body, turning the originally orderly elemental energy into chaotic and chaotic energy. As a result, Bliss' energy shield was like a barrel of oil with a spark thrown into it, exploding in an instant. Although Magi claimed to be evil and desired chaos, at the end of the day, they were still creatures of order that had walked out of the plane. To them, this chaotic and out-of-control void energy was no less than a terrifying poison. Only a powerful force from the soul could prevent the void energy from invading and destroying the elemental energy in a Magus body. As for the light of the soul, it seemed that only grade 5 Magi could activate it. Perhaps this was the main reason why the sorcerer world set the rank of a great sorcerer as the initial rank to step out of the plane. Blitz obviously did not have the light of the soul that only a great Magus could activate. Thus, he could only desperately maintain his energy shield and try his best to drill out of the black pillar of light. Unfortunately, when he was only half a meter away from the edge of the black light, A thorny scorpion above his head couldn't withstand the invasion of the void energy and self-destructed. A tiny beam of light shone directly on his body. In the next second, Blitz's undying worm body collapsed and boiled. The tens of thousands of scorpions scrambled to escape the black light, but they were all entangled by the void energy at the same time, and then exploded into a bloody paste. However, this was not the end. Before the blood that filled the sky could fall to the ground, it was directly vaporized by the violent energy and disappeared without a trace. After the tragic death of the insect Lich Bliss, the 14 thorny scorpions that had gathered to form a shield dispersed and began to run for their lives. A short distance of less than half a meter had cost them 5 lives to escape. As soon as the remaining 9 scorpions escaped from the black pillar of light, they swayed their bodies and quickly gathered at an area 100 meters away. The ground there cracked and the soil churned. A new wave of insects drilled out from the ground and reformed into the appearance of the insect Lich Bliss. However, compared to before, the energy aura of the body that Bliss had formed was much weaker. It seemed like Bliss's soul source had been injured after being killed by the enemy in a moment of carelessness. The black pillar of light lasted for a total of 16 seconds before it gradually disappeared. The battlefield had long since become a scene of desolation, and the terrain had changed beyond recognition. It was a sight to behold. Though the black pillar of light had disappeared, it had left behind a terrifying pit that was close to 100 meters in radius. It was more than 10 meters deep, and the edges of the pit were smooth and clean. For a moment, both sides of the battle, be it the 3 magi or the goblins, were shocked by the terrifying power of the black pillar of light. They sized up the pit in bewilderment, not knowing how to continue. Tygol, who was controlling the metal goblin, knelt at the edge of the pit. His thick metal hands stabbed deep into the soil, unable to control his grief and agony. In less than half an hour of battle, more than 10 of his comrades and companions who had gone through life and death with him had died just like that. After their deaths, even the remains of their corpses had disappeared along with the descent of the black pillar of light. The last trace of them had been taken away by the giant goblin cannons of his own faction. This blow almost caused Tygol's spirit to collapse. He could no longer muster up the courage to fight. Grim raised his head and looked at the giant floating ship once more. Although he was like a little white rabbit in front of a giant elephant compared to the airship, he wasn't afraid at all. On the contrary, he was a little eager to go up and check it out. However, before he could put his thoughts into action, over 100 black dots suddenly appeared on the floating ship in the sky and swooped down towards the battlefield at high speed. With Grim's super eyesight, he could clearly see the nature of these black dots. Combat magic machines. Over 100 combat magic machines. Moreover, from their appearance they were bird-type magic machines that could fly. Grim's heart trembled, and he finally dispelled his previous thoughts. This was not their world, but the world of the goblins. As an invading Tier 2 sorcerer, Grim still had to maintain his vigilance and respect when facing an army of native elites from an entire plane. Therefore, he whistled without hesitation, and Grim took the lead to slip away. The 3 sorcerers displayed their unique skills and scrambled to escape into the dense forest. The densely packed black dots in the sky were like a swarm of bloodthirsty wasps. They buzzed strangely as they chased after them. The gigantic floating ship immediately turned around and followed behind the swarm of wasps, slowly disappearing into the horizon. Now that no one had the time to care about Tygol, he opened the cockpit with a sad expression and jumped to the ground. He staggered around the battlefield to search for the corpses of his fallen companions. He searched the entire forest and every inch of land within a 5-kilometer radius, but he only found the destroyed combat magic machines of 2 of his companions. He personally picked up the mutilated corpse of one of his companions from the unrecognizable magic machine and buried it with tears in his eyes. As for his other companion, His corpse had already exploded into a dripping rain of blood and debris. Yet, Tygol still didn't care about the filth as he collected every drop, every trace, every piece. Then, he stuffed it all into his mouth, crying bitterly as he swallowed it down in large gulps. After doing all of this, for some unknown reason, Tygol's green eyes turned blood red. His entire body began to emit a thick blood energy. He rushed into the cockpit without hesitation and closed the metal cover. The 3-meter-tall metal goblin let out a heart-wrenching roar and rushed into the forest with large strides. The chase in the dense forest continued. Bliss and Mary had long since escaped without a trace. With Mary's speed, even if the combat magic machines in the sky grew 2 more wings, they still wouldn't be able to catch up. As for the insect lich Bliss, he was even more adept at hiding. As long as he burrowed into the ground, it would be impossible for the goblins to find him with their crude technology. Hence, they had long since disappeared, leaving Tygol alone on the battlefield. However, Tygol didn't care at all. Bliss and Mary were only grade 1. In this low-magic goblin plane where even birds wouldn't shit, it was extremely difficult for them to recover their wizard power. Hence, after a fight, they had to hide and recover their strength. However, it was completely different for Tygol. With the strong pulsating flame core in his chest, even if there was no elemental energy in this plane, it could not stop Tygol from absorbing the flame energy from the fire elemental plane. Hence, as long as the intensity of the battle was controlled, Tygol would never run out of energy. Hence, Tygol strode through the forest, opening a path for himself with fireballs from time to time. At the same time, he paid close attention to the combat magic machines in the sky. These guys who were not afraid of death were like flies that smelled blood. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't get rid of them. They chased closely behind Tygol. Once they found a suitable opportunity, they would dive down from the sky in groups of 3 to 5 and attack him. As Tygol escaped, he could see the wreckage of the combat magic machines every 5 to 6 miles. Although they crashed in different places, they all had the same characteristic. That was, none of the goblin mechanics among the combat magic machines survived. After the initial battle, Tygol had already figured out the combat magic machine's fighting style and attacking method. Hence, his counterattack was especially sharp and ruthless. 3 consecutive exploding magma fireballs were enough to break through the energy shield of the combat magic machine. All that was left was a powerful penetrating death gaze. Of course, Tygol was only using flaming rays, but in the eyes of the goblins, it was the most terrifying death gaze. The moment the energy shield of the combat magic machine collapsed, a sharp red line from the burning eyes of the evil wizard would penetrate the cockpit like a laser. Although the line was not as thick as a goblin's little finger, it carried a terrifying flame energy. The moment it touched the body of the goblin mechanic, it would release a terrifying flame energy. Therefore, if one checked all the combat magic machines that were attacked by the death gaze, they would not find the body of the goblin mechanic. They could only see a pile of ashes that had been roasted by the flames. Facing such an enemy that was hard to kill but could still bring death to them, all the goblin mechanics in the air felt a chill from the bottom of their hearts. Under the pressure of Tygol's powerful strength, the morale of the goblins had obviously hit rock bottom. However, at this moment, a deafening roar came from the forest behind them. Tygol suddenly stopped and jumped onto a cliff with a flame leap. He turned around and looked at the forest behind him. The ancient trees along the way were broken and collapsed, and the trees along the way were shaking. At a glance, one would think that there was a terrifying beast traversing through the forest. With a loud crack, 2 tall ancient trees that were closest to him suddenly collapsed. A metal figure that looked vaguely familiar suddenly appeared in Tygol's sight. Chapter 507. In the face of this wild and imposing enemy, Grim looked him in the eye for the first time. Tigul, the captain of the magic machine squad. However, in Grim's eyes, Tigul was only a Grade 1 goblin mechanic who could barely display the strength of a Grade 2 combat machine. As for his identity as a Grade 1 goblin mechanic, although he had the same basic stats as a Grade 1 sorcerer, he did not have the corresponding combat ability. He was only a Grade 1 sorcerer, but he did not have the close combat skills of a physique refinement sorcerer, nor did he have the berserk sorcery of an elemental sorcerer. In this situation, the only thing he could rely on was the combat machine under him. In the previous Tigul, a mechanic was a mechanic and a combat machine was a combat machine. Although the two were stacked together, it was just the difference between the pilot and the controlled. There was nothing special about it. However, at this moment, for some reason, when Grim saw Tigul rushing out of the forest, he vaguely sensed a threatening aura. Human and machine as one? A strange term suddenly appeared in Grim's mind, and he did not know whether to laugh or cry. However, reality did not allow him to think too much. Almost as soon as Tigul rushed out of the jungle, his attack also arrived. Whoosh whoosh, two goblin missiles with orange flames spurting from their tails drew strange trajectories in the air, circling around Grim. However, when they were within 50 meters of Grim, they were directly detonated by the invisible flame barrier. The missile that was loaded with explosives exploded in the air, and countless shrapnel fragments shot out in all directions. This kind of attack was undoubtedly fatal to normal creatures, but to a sorcerer with multiple layers of defense, it was not even worth mentioning. However, the moment the explosion and the huge cloud of smoke blocked Grim's vision, a metallic claw broke through the layers of obstacles and arrived in front of Grim in an instant. Missile attack plus flying claw? Creative. Grim could not help but mutter to himself with a faint smile on his face. This kind of move might be effective against low-grade creatures that only used their eyes and ears to observe the world, but sorcerers used their mental energy to observe the world. In the face of the all-encompassing spiritual perception, those little tricks to confuse people's eyes had no place at all. Grim's body trembled slightly, and he used Flame Leap to appear 50 meters behind him. However, what left him surprised was that just as he walked out from the flames, the metal gnome controlled by Tigul had already turned around and was less than 20 meters away from him. The metal gnome stretched out his hand and shot out thick flames from his palm, using the reaction force to propel his body at a speed 3 to 5 times faster than normal as he pounced towards Grim. However, it did not retract its other hand. Instead, it swung the 10-meter-long metal cable and smashed the metal hand over like a meteor hammer. When the meteor hammer was about to hit him, Grim's flame jump had only lasted for 1 second. If he wanted to flash again, he would need at least 2 seconds. F***ck, his strength had exploded. Grim cursed as he raised his right hand. An equally huge flaming hand condensed in an instant. But at the same time, the metal goblin opened its mouth, and a gun barrel extended out from inside. In the next second, a storm of metal bullets blasted the flaming hand apart. After receiving Tigul's encouragement, a dozen or so combat machines in the sky that were closest to Grim immediately swooped down, looking like they were going to attack from both sides. Damn it, if I don't show you my true colors, you'll think that a Tier 2 sorcerer is a pushover. Grim, who had been at ease all this time, was forced into a corner by Tigul's sudden burst of power. Even his calm mind began to waver. Grim's heart was filled with killing intent. He stretched out his left hand and the Destruction Flame Wizard's staff appeared in his hand. In the next second, flames surged out of his body, instantly turning him into a terrifying flaming man. Hence, a 3-meter-tall goblin metal magical machine and a 2-meter-tall flaming man surrounded by wild flames intertwined like two terrifying demon gods, killing each other crazily. Even more battle magical machines were circling around them, but they could not join the battle. The two demonic godlike fellows fought each other like a carousel. Violent high-temperature flames and metal fragments shot out continuously. Any object that they hit would leave a hole through. Then, the residual flames would burn the object into unrecognizable charcoal in the shortest time possible. For a short time, the Tier 2 Grimm and the Tier 2 Metal Gnome were locked in a stalemate. That's right. At this moment, Grimm's opponent was no longer a Tier 1 Tigul, but a Tier 2 Metal Gnome that had completely fused with the Metal Gnome. Tigul's usage of the Metal Gnome's attacks had reached the limits of the Metal Gnome's capabilities. His own attacks had also reached the pinnacle. Blocking the Metal Gnome's position, rhythm, and relentless pressure were all tactics and tactic. Meanwhile, inside the Metal Gnome's control panel, Tigul desperately controlled the Metal Gnome to dodge and maneuver with blood dripping from the corner of his mouth. At the same time, he frantically requested the giant gnome cannon to fire at him. Thus, after half an hour, the giant gnome finally reached the best position to attack. The terrifying cannon muzzle on its bow was revealed once more. The battle magic machines surrounding the battlefield silently retreated to a distance, waiting anxiously while imprinting every battle move of the Metal Gnome in their minds with reverence and reverence. The giant gnome cannon began charging. The black sun appeared once more. Meanwhile, Grimm was entangled in place by Tigul, unable to escape. Flame jump seemed to happen in an instant, but it still required around half a second to prepare. Under Tigul's interference, Grimm had no choice but to painfully admit that he couldn't even fight for half a second. He could only accompany Tigul, who was unafraid of death, as they waited for the black pillar of light to descend. They didn't have to wait for long. After 45 seconds, the giant gnome cannon's muzzle trembled slightly, and a 2-meter-wide black pillar of light shot out towards the battlefield. The black pillar of light quickly expanded from 2 meters to 10 meters, 20 meters, 50 meters. By the time it reached the battlefield on the ground, it had already expanded to a 100-meter diameter. No flesh and blood creature could survive within the black pillar of light. At the very least, the low-level creatures in the planar plane would find it difficult to resist. Just as the goblin mechanics opened their hatches and silently sent the great Tigul off, a huge cluster of flames suddenly appeared outside the range of the black pillar of light. Grimm walked out of it with the metal goblin whose limbs were limp. What happened? Did I fail? Countless questions appeared in the minds of the gnome mechanic. They silently stared at the two in the distance, not knowing how to react. Grimm loosened his grip and tossed the metal gnome to the ground. He wiped the cold sweat off his forehead and congealed a large flaming hand. He tore open the metal plate and revealed the green gnome Tigulo, who was similarly limp and limp. "Why did you save me?" Black blood flowed out of the corner of Tigul's mouth. He screamed, "We are enemies! Why did you save me?" Grimm smiled coldly. "Because I was happy." Such a simple sentence instantly made Tigul choke for a long time. After a long time, he cursed, "Don't be so smug. If it wasn't for the fact that my magic machine just happened to run out of energy, do you think you could have escaped from the black light alive?" Grimm sneered. "Your metal gnome has 7 sets of magic energy batteries installed, and each set of batteries can sustain your magic machine for 5 minutes of basic combat. And your explosive power just now increased the battery consumption by 37%, the damage to your magic machine by 25%, and the duration of combat decreased by more than 46%. If you hadn't calculated the time accurately, do you think I would have played with you until now?" Tigul's fierce eyes were frightened by the other party's calm calculation. In the battle just now, he had relied on his blood to explode. During the battle, he had never calculated, and it was impossible for him to calculate such precise numbers. Out of respect for his opponent, he could feel that every number that the other party said was completely true. But if it was all true, didn't that mean that the entire battle had been in the palm of the other party's hand all along? Then what could be more damaging to his confidence and fighting spirit than this? The blood energy on Tigul's body instantly dissipated, and his entire body withered once more. The other party came from the terrifying Magus world, a large plane renowned throughout the multiverse. It was also a place where evil and cruel plane conquerors gathered. The knowledge and power that the other party grasped were clearly far above that of the gnomes. Could the gnome empire really fight against such an enemy? Just as Tigul's heart was trembling and he didn't know how to face his own heart, Grim turned around and looked at the slowly advancing magic machine army. His entire body turned into a ball of flames once more, and he disappeared from the battlefield. The other party left. The other party didn't kill him. For some reason, Tigul didn't feel the slightest bit of joy at having escaped. Instead, he felt a kind of sorrow and depression. Perhaps, I should have died in that black light, Tigul thought in a daze. Tens of miles away from the battlefield, Grim met up with Mary and Bliss, who had taken a detour. Of course, Grim could not avoid Mary's complaints. She complained that he shouldn't have taken the risk so easily. Let's go. We need to shake off the giant floating ship's pursuit before it gets here. Grim said a few simple words, and then quickly fled with the two of them. Master, after a few days, who will we teleport to next time? Bug Lich Bliss couldn't help but ask curiously. Chapter 508. With the sorcerer's strange spells, it was almost impossible for the goblins to track them for a long period of time. Hence, when Grim took out the demon crocodile hunter that he hadn't seen in a long time and slowly sank it into the ground, the goblin mechanics that swarmed over were all dumbfounded. They had yet to develop a tool to track an enemy that was stealthily moving underground. Hence, the only thing they could do was to mobilize more local garrisons to cover every corner of this region and strive to find traces of the enemy as soon as possible. In fact, they didn't even need to search. At a certain moment 5 days later, they once again detected that strange spatial ripple. The source of the spatial ripple turned out to be another goblin province thousands of miles away. Karai region. In a hidden basement, the mechanical girl Sabrina and the poisonous centipede Ender fell to the ground in pain as soon as they crossed over to another plane. But in comparison, the pressure that Sabrina had to endure was obviously lighter than Ender's. Perhaps this had something to do with her compatibility with the laws of the plane here. Due to the unique racial characteristics of the Goblin Empire, only the goblins could call the shots in this land and hold the position of ruler. Along the way, be it the goblin caravans riding on giant kodos or the goblin villages and towns that could be seen everywhere, those who could become nobles and own large amounts of land, manors, and mines were all goblins. As for the other races, they could only do dirty, dangerous, and lowly jobs. To be honest, seeing the goblins dressed in red and green with makeup sitting on carriages swaggering through the streets, followed closely by humans and elves serving them attentively, and carried the carriages by burly trolls or minotaurs shouting slogans. After seeing such a scene so many times, the wizards couldn't help but feel that they were going insane. The trolls had strong bodies and great strength, so they became the best miners and slaves for the goblins. The indigenous humans were weak, but they were good at learning and creation, so they became the goblins' butlers, tailors, and bakers. The wood elves were naturally weak, but they had great talent in plants, so they became the gardeners and planters of the goblins' manors. Countless native races were utterly defeated by the goblins' guns and cannons. For the continuation of their race, they could only obediently become their captives and slaves. The goblins had tamed giant rhinoceros-like kodos as long-distance transportation tools, tamed chocobos as land mounts, tamed hippohawks as flying mounts, tamed tiger sharks as sea mounts, and these were all just auxiliary tools for the goblins' armed forces. The true embodiment of the Goblin Empire's dominance was the engineering magic equipment and battle magic equipment that were scattered all over the place. From the gnome villages and cities that Grim and his companions passed by, it could be seen that the education rate among the gnomes was almost 100%. Moreover, their young goblins would be tested for various talents from a young age. Then, they would be nurtured in different directions according to their individual abilities. Currently, the most popular profession in the Gnome Empire was the gnome mechanic. Becoming a goblin mechanic would allow one to become a noble among the goblins in a single step and come into contact with all kinds of engineering magic machinery. Only those who achieved outstanding results in controlling engineering magic equipment had the right to advance further and become a battle magic equipment operator. In the past 100 years, as the Goblin Empire's mana usage improved by leaps and bounds, there were more and more models of battle magic equipment, and their power was far greater than before. Therefore, in the entire Goblin Empire, any goblin would take pride in becoming a battle magic equipment operator. Apart from the goblin mechanic, the Goblin Empire also had many subprofessions, such as goblin engineers, goblin alchemists, goblin blacksmiths, goblin musketeers, goblin cannoneers, goblin tankers, goblin pilots, goblin technicians. It had to be said that the goblins were generally short and weak. If not for the engineering magic and alchemy that gave them a foothold, they would not have the ability to control an entire plane with their current strength. If one wanted to understand the goblins, they had to mention the most impressive thing about them: their adventurous spirit. There were many powerful races in this plane, but why did they not become the rulers of the plane? Instead, the skinny goblins became the son of the plane. One of the main reasons was that the goblins had an abnormal passion for knowledge and technology that surpassed other races. In every goblin town or city, the largest and most luxurious building would definitely be a goblin alchemy laboratory. Moreover, there would definitely be rows of goblin sages standing at the entrance of the alchemy laboratory. In the Goblin Empire, those who could be called sages were great goblin inventors who had made groundbreaking contributions to goblin engineering or goblin alchemy. Relying on their accumulation over the generations, the goblins had evolved from the alchemy laboratory to the engineering civilization, and then from the engineering civilization to the steam civilization. Now there was a new energy system, mana. Based on Grimm's experience, if the goblin plane was given another 100 or 200 years to develop, they would definitely be able to evolve into a mana civilization. When that time came, it would be time for them to step out of the narrow goblin plane and carefully explore other planes. Unfortunately, while they were painfully going through the transition from a steam civilization to a mana civilization, Grimm and the others had arrived. Perhaps this was the fate of the goblin plane. Because of Grimm, the goblin plane had a chance to rise in power, but also because of Grimm, the goblin plane had to face the invasion and greed of the powerful sorcerer world. If the goblin plane was lucky enough to kill Grimm and the others, they would be able to obtain a gift from the distant sorcerer civilization. At that time, everything that Grimm and the others had in mind would become a driving force for the goblin plane's rapid development. However, fortune and misfortune were interdependent. If the goblins wanted to obtain something, they had to first pay a price. And the price they paid was the fate of the goblin plane. Would the goblin plane kill the invading sorcerers and increase its power to a higher level, or would it be defeated by the sorcerers and become a subsidiary plane of the sorcerer world? This was the fate that the goblin plane had to face. When Sabrina and Ender arrived at the goblin plane, they brought a message from Alice to Grimm. "Be careful of Gaz-Ruvi." It was a simple sentence, but it made Grimm suddenly understand. At this moment, Grimm was sure that he and the others had fallen into Duke Gaz-Ruvi's trap during this trip to the Goblin Plane. For some unknown reason, Gaz-Ruvi had intentionally or unintentionally leaked the coordinates of the Goblin Plane to Cabby, and then smoothly received the problematic magic stones. If they followed the normal procedure, Grimm and the others would have used the silver void stone hidden in the magic stones as the coordinates to travel to the Goblin Plane. What awaited them would be mountains of battle magic machines and an impregnable cage trap. Perhaps because she sensed something was wrong, Alice gave up on the silver void stone coordinates and sent the bug Lich Bliss into the Goblin Plane using the chaotic teleportation method. This was obviously out of Duke Gaz-Ruvi's expectations. When Gazruvi realized that the wizards from the other plane did not appear in the trap according to the preset script, there was a sudden news of a space invasion from somewhere in the Goblin Empire. He knew that his plan had failed, so he brought a large number of his subordinates out of the capital in an aggressive manner, wanting to capture and kill the wizards before they grew stronger. But when he really came into contact with a few wizards, Gazruvi was surprised to find that the reason why wizards could become the fearful slave owners and invaders of the plane world was indeed because of their own skills and strange witchcraft. The three magi who had invaded earlier were all very difficult to deal with and strange to deal with. Even if he brought the most elite magic machine legion of the Goblin Empire, it was still difficult to gain any advantage over them. Therefore, when Gazruvi once again sensed a strange space fluctuation, he immediately led a large number of his subordinates to the source of the space fluctuation. This time, it had brought 2 floating warships and thousands of combat magical machines. In a cave at the edge of the Kozanla Mountains, a bonfire was lit in the middle of the dark cave. The flickering flames illuminated the small space, and also reflected a few figures beside the fire. Large pieces of bear meat were cleaned and slowly roasted on the fire. Poison Woman Ender was indeed a witch who had been out all year round. She was quite good at cooking and roasting food. Golden fat overflowed from the fat meat, sizzling as it was burned by the bonfire. From time to time, the Poison Woman would pinch some colorful powder from the seasoning bag in her arms and sprinkle it on the meat, making it more fragrant. Although the few present were all powerful wizards, and their body structure was completely different from ordinary humans, most of their human nature was still preserved. Just like the mechanical girl Sabrina, several of her main organs and most of her external limbs had been replaced by alchemy machines. Moreover, her stomach had already become a miniature furnace, able to instantly break down anything she ate into the most basic nutrients and food residue. Because this way of digestion had the highest energy efficiency, there was very little food residue produced. Therefore, overcooked food was not necessary for her at all. Most of the time, she would get more energy from eating the original, bloody bear meat than the barbecued ones. However, as a former human, Sabrina still retained most of her human habits and nature. Chapter 509. Tell me, why did you bring me here so early? Endo the poison centipede asked absent-mindedly as he took out a small knife and cut the golden-brown bear meat into edible strips and put them on his plate while he asked casually. According to the original plan, Sabrina and Cabby were supposed to be in the 3rd batch of transmigrators. However, Grimm had changed the order of the list and moved Ender from the 4th batch to the 3rd. That was why she had appeared here 5 days earlier. With the Hikila resonating crystal, Grimm and Alice in the sorcerer world could maintain a close connection even if they were in 2 different planes. Because this place suits you better. Grimm chuckled as he praised Ender's cooking. After a few battles with the goblins, I realize that you're the most suitable person to deal with them. Are you talking about using poison? Ender asked hesitantly. Yes. Here, we're at a disadvantage in terms of numbers. Due to the huge difference in races, it's difficult for us to disguise ourselves and hide somewhere. So, it's going to be a long and drawn-out guerrilla warfare. If they chase and we run, it'll be difficult for us to establish a foothold. That's why you thought of using poison. Not poison, but plague. Grimm's black pupils flashed with a cold glint under the light of the bonfire. Poisoning hundreds of goblins won't help us much. What I need now is a terrifying plague that can threaten the entire goblin plane. Only when most of the goblins in this realm are under our control will they give up their infatuation and fanaticism for mana and submit to us. Everyone present was a pure sorcerer trained by the sorcerer world. They were not surprised by Grimm's plan to poison an entire plane. Instead, they frowned as they considered the feasibility of the plan. I do have some good plague bacteria here. If I spread them, it won't be a problem to kill hundreds of thousands of goblins. But, Ender hesitated for a moment. These little guys aren't that easy to control. Once they're out of our hands, it'll be very difficult to control them again. We might be able to use them to scare the goblins, but if we want to negotiate with them, we'll need to improve our control over the source of the plague bacteria. That's not a problem. Grim chuckled and stretched out his hand. The secret voodoo scroll that had been hanging on his waist flew into his palm. Under the urging of his wizard power, a wooden doll with dense wizard runes carved all over its body appeared in front of everyone. Seeing everyone, the wooden doll opened its wooden mouth and made a strange sound similar to that of a human baby. At first, its 2 wooden eyeballs were a little sluggish, but it soon became as agile as a normal human. Voodoo doll. A benevolent smile appeared on the ugly face of the poison centipede. Looks like you've really nurtured this little fellow well. Its spiritual intelligence is also very complete. It will definitely be a great help to you in the future. It shouldn't be a problem to control the plague bacteria, right? Grim asked humbly. Although this voodoo doll was personally cultivated by him, there were still many complicated and trivial problems that needed to be solved before it matured. That was why Grim could only be a humble and studious disciple in front of the poison god Ender. Yes. Ender nodded. Let your voodoo doll devour my plague bacteria, combining the plague and voodoo into one. That way we can completely control the scope of the plague and whether it will break out or not. Once most of the goblins in this realm are infected, it will be time for you to negotiate with the goblin ruler. After sneering a few times, the poison centipede stretched out his skinny hands and carefully took out a medicine bottle from his waist pouch. The medicine bottle was not big, only the size of a fist. It was jet black, and its lid was sealed with dense runes. Grim tried to use it, but even his mental strength could not penetrate the runes to see what was inside. From this, it could be seen that the medicine bottle itself was already a wizard artifact. Some items that needed to be stored in a wizard artifact. Grim's heart skipped a beat, and he looked forward to seeing the plague bacteria that Ender had mentioned. Following a strange process, he first tapped a few spots on the body of the medicine bottle, then brought it to his mouth and chanted a few spells in a low voice. The runes on the medicine bottle were finally removed. Get your voodoo doll ready. At this moment, the poison centipede's expression was extremely solemn. Once the plague bacteria spreads, even I will not be able to retrieve it or completely destroy it. The other magi retreated far away to avoid interfering with the two's actions. As magi, they would not be able to survive a normal plague even if it invaded their bodies. However, could the plague bacteria that even poison centipede Ender was treating with such caution be ordinary? Hence, in order to avoid trouble, they could only retreat for the time being. Grim's black eyes flashed, and a red flame barrier enveloped him and poisoned centipede Ender without a sound. This way, they could avoid outside interference, and also prevent the plague bacteria from escaping. Poison centipede Ender took out a sky-blue crystal leaf and placed it in his mouth, then gently lifted the cover of the medicine bottle. A glossy green fog floated out from within. Having suddenly escaped, the green fog had intended to quietly disperse into the surrounding air. However, under the pressure of the flame barrier, the spores of the plague bacteria burst into flames, and the formless and colorless plague bacteria were forced to gather into a ball, resisting the invasion of the dense fire elements in the air. Grim's face was full of joy as he looked at the floating green mist. He couldn't help but praise it in his heart. In this world, all pathogenic bacteria spread in more or less the same way. They could split into numerous tiny spores from the body of the plague fungus, and then they would disperse in the air. It was precisely because the spores were so tiny that they could not be seen with the naked eye, and only magi could sense their existence with their spiritual force. This was why the plague bacteria had such a terrifying reputation. Now, the plague bacteria in front of Grimm were able to form a group on their own even when their escape route was cut off, and they relied on their advantage in numbers to resist the invasion of the fire elements. This, from a certain point of view, this already gave them the basic intelligence of a group. It was likely that poison centipede Ender had spent a lot of effort to cultivate such plague bacteria. For some reason, the voodoo doll sitting on the secret voodoo scroll became excited when it saw the green fog, and could not help but babble to Grimm. None of the magi present could understand its language. Even Grimm had to rely on the secret voodoo scroll to understand it. Grimm put his right hand together, and the flame barrier that he had spread out began to shrink rapidly with the green fog as the center. In order to resist the fire elements, the green fog could only compress its internal space, condensing into a thumb-sized green jelly bean. Only then was it able to reach a certain balance with the flame barrier. Grimm held the fist-sized flame barrier in front of the voodoo doll, and its wooden eyes immediately revealed a joyful smile. It dived into the barrier and swallowed the jelly bean. As the plague poison entered its stomach, the rune lines on the voodoo doll's body lit up involuntarily. Strange witchcraft runes appeared and disappeared one after another, illuminating its wooden body and eyebrows with a pale green color. The voodoo doll burped like a human, turned around, and dove back into the secret voodoo scroll, disappearing without a trace. Grimm casually flipped open the voodoo secret scroll. There were originally several pages, but now there was only one left. Within a silver sorcerer's bracelet, the voodoo doll was sleeping soundly inside. The AI chip's prompt sounded in Grimm's mind. There are 17 hours 26 minutes 54 seconds until the voodoo doll finishes digesting the plague bacteria. There are 37 hours 28 minutes 13 seconds until the voodoo doll splits the plague spirit seed. Grimm nodded his head in satisfaction. Everyone, let's rest here for a while. 37 hours later, we'll get the first batch of plague spirit seeds, and then we'll be able to go all out. Everyone believed Grimm's words without a doubt. It could be said that the main reason why they were willing to follow Grimm into danger was because they believed in his strength and foresight. To be honest, Grimm's faction was still too weak. Looking at it with his fingers, he felt that the number of Magi Grimm had gathered in the blazing flame monarch surpassed the number of Magi the Salubo family had stationed in Fedinin City. Did this mean that Grimm's faction's strength had already surpassed the Salubo family's strength? No, whoever thought that would be too stupid and ignorant. Even though Grimm's camp was strong and full of talents, after a bloody and cruel planar war, how many of them would be left? It had to be known that in the Knight's Plane, even with a great magus like Salubo holding the line and 2 grade 3 Magi acting as the main force, the Salubo family had still lost 9 Magi before they managed to take down the Knight's Plane. Although the Goblin Plane that Grimm had chosen was far weaker than the Knight's Plane, it had a hidden trump card in the form of magic energy. If they went all out and clashed head-on with such a large Goblin empire, the number of invading Magi who died would definitely be terrifying. Would Grimm's faction be able to pay such a price? Hence, in order to prevent his troops from dying in a single battle, Grimm could only bear the brunt of the danger himself and think of other ways to reduce the strength of the goblins. Chapter 510. 2 days later, the first poison spirit seed was finally born. And so, Bug-Lich Bliss became the first magus to leave the group. The main group continued to advance towards the capital of the Goblin Empire, Anvil, while Bliss took the poison spirit seed south. Grimm's mission was to soak the poison spirit seed in the wells or water sources of every goblin village or city for 15 minutes. Such a task was neither difficult nor easy. First, it required the person in charge of the mission to have a way to hide their track. Otherwise, a non-human would have to travel through the Goblin Empire's territory and get close to the source of water that they relied on for sustenance. This in itself was not a small challenge. But with Bug-Lich Bliss's formless body, this was not a problem at all. Based on the information he had gathered over the past few days, Grimm had already drawn a map of the entire Goblin Plain. The capital, Anvilmar, was at the center of the plain. It was surrounded by mountains and steep terrain, a place that normal creatures could not easily set foot in. Thus, the goblins used their race's powerful engineering abilities to build a city of metal at the steepest part of the mountain, the City of Steel. 120,000 high-level goblins lived there all year round, and it was a city of technology where goblin engineers, inventors, and alchemists gathered. It was a city of miracles. In the past 1,000 years, the goblins had almost hollowed out the mountain below the City of Steel in order to inject an endless supply of energy into their mechanical civilization, using vast amounts of coal and steam to support the operation of the City of Steel. Now, with the appearance of mana, the goblins had built a 10-story tall spatial furnace in the mountain, using the magical energy absorbed by the furnace to push the goblin civilization towards large-scale usage of mana. The goblins did not seem to have any intention of keeping this information a secret. Instead, they promoted the advantages and benefits of mana on a large scale within their race, calling for more goblin engineers and alchemists to study mana seriously. It was a pity that the Goblin Empire's research into goblin runes was too shallow and crude, and the miniaturization of the spatial furnace was progressing slowly. Otherwise, if every combat machine was equipped with a miniature spatial furnace, they would be able to break free from the shackles of mana batteries and become battle machines that never stopped killing. Up until now, the Goblin Empire had only been able to install spatial furnaces on large magical equipment such as giant airship. They were used as the power source of small and miniature magic machinery to support the continuous battles and killings of the Magic Machinery Legion. However, with the goblin mechanic's physique at the level of a quasi-wizard, it was still a question if he could endure this kind of continuous battle. After all, there were very few individuals like Tigul who had crossed the extraordinary threshold. Most goblin mechanics still had bodies of flesh and blood. They needed to eat, drink, excrete, and sleep. In fact, after a bloody battle, most of the goblin mechanics would have an additional psychological burden. Even the Tier 1 goblin mechanic, Tigul, could not avoid this. Who told it to have an extraordinary body, but not the spirit and soul to match it. Hence, even when the Tier 1 Tigul controlled the Tier 2 metal gnome, he could only barely display the strength of a pseudo-Tier 2. Grimm wasn't optimistic about the Goblin City that the Goblin Empire had spent so much effort to build, Steel City. There was only one reason, and that was these idiots had actually built the spatial furnace beneath the Steel City. Didn't this mean that the most elite group of high-grade goblins in the entire Goblin Empire were living on a huge barrel of explosives? Moreover, they were still stuffing sex into this bucket day and night. Of course, as indigenous goblins, they could probably find thousands of reasons to do so. After all, the entire Goblin Plain was trembling under the rule of the goblin muskets and goblin cannons. There was no enemy in the plain that could threaten the order of the Goblin Empire. Moreover, for the massive Steel City to continue operating for thousands of years, finding a clean, pollution-free, and endless energy source was the most important thing to ensure the continuation of the Goblin civilization. So, in a situation where there were no internal or external threats, and they were in urgent need of energy, it was not too strange for the ruler of the Goblin Empire to make such a choice. But now that Grimm and the rest were here, the Magi would make use of any hidden dangers and flaws in the Goblin Empire, turning it into the first Camino that would topple the Goblin civilization. What Grimm wanted to do the most now was to sneak into the Steel City and throw a fireball into the super-spatial furnace that the Goblins had meticulously built. It would definitely be a huge fireworks display that would shake the entire plain. However, to achieve this goal, there were still many difficult tasks that he had to complete step by step. So, the only thing Grimm could do now was to desperately spread the plague spirit seeds throughout the entire goblin plain, increasing his bargaining chips in the later stages of the negotiations. It couldn't be helped. Grimm couldn't use a mutually destructive method to obtain the goblin plain. Otherwise, if a large number of plagues were to spread, the number of creatures that could survive in this plane would be reduced to 1 in 10. By then, perhaps the plane would no longer have the strength to resist, but it would also lose its basic strength. Grimm wanted to develop the resources in this plane, but where could he find so many free laborers? Could he buy cheap slaves from the Magus world? Developing a plane didn't require a few hundred or a few thousand basic laborers, but tens of thousands of adult slaves with strong physical strength. Furthermore, there needed to be a mature social system within the plane to be able to support the more people that would emerge from it. If he wanted to obtain large amounts of rare metals, he had to organize a large number of laborers to excavate metal ores and transport them to the surface. That was not all. He also needed to filter the coarse ores, and then smelt the high-quality ores into metal ingot. This process was usually accompanied by the extraction and purification of rare metals. So, if he wanted to develop the metal mines and other rare resources in the plane on a large scale, he had to rely on the established social system. If the natives of this plane were all wiped out by the plague, and Grimm had to build a social system from scratch to complete the development of the plane's resources, it would take at least 100 years. Because of this, Grimm decided to spread a plague in the Goblin Plain, which was strictly controlled by the Goblin Plain. It would deal a heavy blow to the Goblin Empire, but at the same time, the power of the entire plane would not be overturned. To be honest, it was easier said than done. But for the sake of his ideals and beliefs, Grimm could only try. Fortunately, the Goblin Plain did not belong to him, so he could do whatever he wanted. If the ruler of the Goblin Empire was still stubborn after detonating the superspace furnace, Grimm did not mind turning the entire Goblin Plain into a wasteland. After all, only the benefits in his hands belonged to him. If he could not take the whole shop away, Grimm did not mind smashing it into pieces. Even if the meat was rotten, it would be in his own pot. 2 days later, after the second poison spirit seed appeared, Mary left the team and went to the west of the Goblin continent alone. However, on the second day after Mary left, Grimm and the other two were caught up by the Magic Weapon Corps in the wilderness. But the Magic Weapon Corps retreated as quickly as they came. The reason why they were willing to give up on the enemy they had been chasing for 6 days was because a terrifying wizard appeared in Grimm's team, the Poison Centipede. After 6 days, they finally caught up with Grimm and the others again. Hundreds of magic weapons from the Magic Weapon Corps charged at them from all directions like a swarm of bees. What welcomed them was the Poison Centipede's poison aura. Poison Centipede set up a small altar in the wilderness and used it to increase the range of his poison aura, expanding it from the original 100 meters to the current 500 meters. Therefore, the magic weapons that rushed into the poison aura were hit without even realizing it. When Venomous Centipede Ender activated the poison rune, the explosive poison instantly destroyed almost 100 battle magic machines. In an instant, magic weapons fell from the sky like rain. They plunged into the ground and no longer moved. The lethal poison penetrated through the ventilation holes on the surface of the combat magic machine and killed the goblin mechanic inside. No matter how strong the magic weapons were, without the control of a mechanic, they were just cold metal block. Therefore, in front of Poison Centipede, as long as the goblin mechanics still needed to breathe, they had no hope of survival. Of course, Grimm and the others knew the principle of witchcraft very well, but the attacking Devil Machine Legion knew nothing about it. The Magic Weapon Corps commander was still urging his subordinates to join the battle and not let the evil wizards escape. But who would have thought that with just a flash of green light in the hands of the ugly and evil old witch, nearly 100 magic weapons fell to the ground as if they had lost their souls. No matter how the Magic Weapon Corps commander called out, he could not get any response from the magic weapons. Not long after, the few demonic machines that were sent into the battlefield suddenly fell to the ground without any warning, and could no longer be contacted. Faced with such a strange scene, the Magic Weapon Corps commander almost went crazy. He could understand dying in an intense battle. He could also understand dying in a harsh environment. However, everything was fine before, but with just a flash of green light in the hands of the other party, all of them died in battle. His poor brain could not accept such a thing. Therefore, the Magic Weapon Corps commander, who was scared out of his wits by the unknown, could only order a retreat. More than 100 magic weapons that covered the sky were destroyed in the blink of an eye, and the number of magic weapons that could escape far away could be counted on two hands. Such a tragic loss made the goblins grieve, and they only dared to wait until the wizards were far away before sneaking back to the scene and taking away a few magic weapons. After an examination by the goblin doctor, they found out that all the goblin mechanics died of poison. Chapter 511. Losing close to 100 combat magic machines before the battle even started was a huge blow to the goblins. Of course, they were not distressed by the combat magic machines, but the goblin mechanics hidden within them. To be honest, the 100 combat magic machines that fell from the sky could be brought back to the workshop for a simple repair before they could be used again. However, the goblin mechanics that were poisoned to death was a real loss. As the local goblins fled in panic, the one who was the happiest and most excited was not Poison Dog Ender, but Mechanical Girl Sabrina. Ever since she activated the mechanical core in her body, she had the ability to assimilate alchemy machines. As far as the eye could see, there were close to 100 broken battle magic machines around her, which meant that there were close to 100 mini treasure vaults waiting for her to visit. Sabrina was like a little girl who had accidentally entered a mysterious treasure trove. Her excitement was indescribable. The mechanical eye hidden under the silver mask shot out a beautiful light beam that could be seen with the naked eye. She wandered around the combat magic machines that were in strange shapes while scanning the mechanical devices inside them. It was obvious that the Goblin Empire did not have the concept of mass production. Every single combat magic machine was a beautiful work of art. Close to 100 combat magic machines had close to 100 styles and creativity. It was obvious that they were the work of different masters. Because the Goblin Empire used a system of craftsmen, a goblin engineer would be responsible for all the mechanical parts of a combat magic machine, as well as the ratio of the alloy materials. Even something as small as a metal screw was single-handedly made by this gnome engineer. The advantage of this was that every combat magic machine had its own person in charge, and was qualified to be a great work of art. Therefore, the mechanical girl Sabrina wandered among the treasured items, searching for mechanical components that could benefit her with all her might. As the most basic weapon of the goblin combat magic machines, the goblin musket was abandoned by Sabrina. The reason was that its attack power was too low. Even with a barrage of bullets, it could not change the fact that the goblin musket was a low-level weapon. Of course, if Grimm could spend some effort to engrave explosion and penetration runes on each of the metal projectiles, it would be worth it to use it as a long-range support weapon. The goblin flamethrower was a weapon commonly used by the goblins to suppress their enemies at close range. The flames it sprayed did not contain any elemental components, but a kind of combustion reaction formed when the alchemy powder came into contact with the air. This kind of alchemy flame had an upper limit. Even if it was stacked, it could only reach a true temperature of 2,500 degrees. If converted to the energy intensity that wizards were used to, it would only be 120 degrees. This might be enough to threaten a Grade 1 Magus, but it was the funniest joke in the world to deal with a Grade 2 Magus, especially a fire Magus like Grimm who was immune to fire. Sabrina removed the goblin flamethrower from the battle magic machines and played with it for a while, before giving up regretfully. However, she had collected quite a number of flamethrowers hidden in the flamethrower. Sabrina dismantled 7 or 8 combat magic machines in one go. She was attracted by many delicate mechanical devices. XD-57 Circular Guided Rocket Set, GG-117 Miniature Rocket Backpack, Mana Field * Magic Ray Gun, Goblin Self-Balancing Gyroscope, Goblin Energy Spectrometer. There were too many strange devices, and almost every one of them had its own unique purpose. While Sabrina was busy picking, Grim, who had nothing to do, came to help her. First of all, in order to increase Sabrina's combat power, it was necessary to have a variety of attack methods. The XD-57 Circular Guided Rocket Set was the best choice for her ultra-long-range attack. The XD-57 Circular Guided Rocket Set stored 5 miniature goblin rockets, which had an attack range of 1,200 to 2,400 meters. This attack range was more than 3 to 4 times that of witchcraft, which was the limit of long-range attack. Of course, the explosion damage of the goblin rockets could only reach 70 degrees, and it only relied on the pure physical damage of the shrapnel, which could easily be blocked by a wizard's defensive witchcraft. Since the goblins did not have the so-called long-range guidance, nor did they know how to use their spiritual power to guide the rockets, the circular guided rocket set was purely a rough guess. Within 500 meters, the deviation of the goblins' circular guided rocket set was 30 meters, the deviation of the rockets within 1,000 meters was 100 meters, and the target within 2,000 meters could only be hit in that direction. The reason for this was completely due to the physical attributes of the goblin machinists. Even with the help of the Goblin Engineering Enhanced Goggles, the vision range of a normal goblin was only about 1,500 meters. Beyond this range, even if the goblin weapons could reach this distance, the machinists who controlled the goblin weapons would be blind. Whether or not they could hit the enemy, this had become a problem that only the goblin god could solve. Compared to the goblins, of course, Sabrina did not have this problem. Even without the help of witchcraft, Sabrina could easily use her spiritual power and mechanical eyes to control the movement within 1,000 meters. If she used the witchcraft eye, any area within 5,000 meters could be seen clearly in front of her. With this ultra-long-range vision, if she modified the goblin rockets, Sabrina could launch ultra-long-range attacks without the goblin's line of sight. More importantly, this kind of attack did not need to consume her own wizard power. As for the limitation of the ammunition, the goblins could not solve this problem. They could only rely on their own magical machinery to carry as much as possible. Once the attack was over, the set would become a useless piece of metal. However, as a machinist, Sabrina had a storage ring with a large space, so the supply of ammunition was not a problem at all. When Grimm analyzed the situation for Sabrina, she was immediately tempted. She could not help it. Even in the goblin plane, when it came to battle analysis, Sabrina's first imaginary enemy was still a wizard of the same level. Her brain would automatically discard all the weapons that could not pose a fatal threat to a wizard of the same level. However, now that she was in the goblin plane, these weapons might not be useful against wizards, but they were perfect against goblins. Other than the XD-57 Circular Guided Rocket Set, the GG-117 Miniature Rocket Backpack was also of great help to Sabrina. With just a small modification, the GG-117 Miniature Rocket Backpack could become a powerful weapon for teleportation. With the help of the miniature rocket ejector, Sabrina could move forward, backward, or left and right at will during the battle. Besides, there was no pattern to her movements, which made it difficult for people to capture her possible position in the next second. The Magical Energy Zone Cannon was just a cannon modified from a magical energy battery. It could create magical energy turbulence within a radius of 20 meters, effectively disrupting the core of a magical machinery that had lost the protection of its energy shield. Of course, it was also useful against wizards. At least, if a wizard was entangled by the turbulent magical energy, it would be a heavy burden to the balance of the elemental energy in his body. Before using the elemental energy in his body to destroy the turbulent magical energy, the wizard would basically lose the ability to cast spells. The principle of the magical energy ray gun was similar to the magical energy zone cannon, but its attack mode was in the form of energy rays. Its range was only 20 to 30 meters, and its energy attack power was 35 degrees. If the range was any further, the magical energy ray gun would be destabilized by the trace elements in the air, and it would no longer be able to cause any damage. After figuring out the principle of these magical energy weapons, Grimm could not help but frown. In the previous war, the goblins did not seem to have similar magical energy weapons, but after only 6 days, they had already developed mature magical energy weapons. This terrifying scientific research ability made Grimm a little worried. To be honest, if Grimm and the others did not know about the changes in the magical machinery and still used the same method to fight against the magical machinery, the goblins would probably leave them with unforgettable injuries. Fortunately, they had poison centipede ender this time. A super large poison aura actually wiped out the entire magical machinery legion. Such a change must have been unexpected by Prince Gaz Ruvi behind the scenes. Even without thinking, Grimm could imagine the ridiculous expression of the mastermind behind the magical machinery legion as he stood up and looked at the deformed magical machinery on the ground. No matter who it was, the invincible magic machine legion that they had obtained by smashing mountains of gold and silver was silently killed by an ugly and senile old witch. They would definitely not be in a good mood. Even though the Goblin Empire controlled an entire plane, it only had a magical machinery legion of less than 1,000 people. Now that poison centipede Endo had killed 1/10 of them in a single breath, anyone in his place would have vomited blood. Since they had found so many useful things, the 3 of them would not hold back. With Sabrina taking the lead, the 3 of them immediately turned into a demolition team and swept through the magical machinery one by one. They dismantled all the items and parts that caught their eye and stuffed them into their storage rings. The 3 of them had never received proper training in dismantling magical machinery, so they could not be gentle during the process. It was the most violent dismantling. Therefore, after they swept through the place instantly became a graveyard for magical machinery. Metal baffles, bolts, bronze gears, pipes, and metal shells were strewn everywhere. All the metal components and strange devices inside the magical machinery that had magical auras became their spoils of war. They packed them up and took them away. The few battle magical machines that were hiding in the mountains in the distance were infuriated. They gritted their teeth in hatred, but there was nothing they could do. However, Grimm had obviously underestimated the goblin's desire for revenge. Just as he was happily dismantling the magical machinery, the space above his head suddenly rippled. With his knowledge, he could naturally tell that something was about to be teleported over from somewhere else. Could the goblins teleport? As soon as this stupid question appeared in his mind, Grimm remembered the interplanar teleportation device that Kirby had obtained. Abnormal spatial ripples detected. Host, please remain alert. Countdown begins. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Following the AI chip's prompt, a hole the size of a human head opened up at the core of the spatial ripples, and a pure metal alchemy chick emerged from it. In the next second, the alchemy chick suddenly let out a strange cry. Begin self-destruction. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.